Story 1. The 1,400 Level Shadow. My name is Elias, and I used to be a skeptic. I spent 12 years in the military and another 6 in high-end private security. I don't scare easy. I certainly didn't believe in hauntings. But 3 months at the Kennecott Mill in Alaska changed that. I was hired by a historical preservation group to do overnight rounds, ensuring no one broke in to vandalize the old copper works. They told me the building was settling and that I'd hear noises. They didn't tell me that the noises would start answering back. They didn't tell me about the thing that lives in the 1,400 level drift. The mill is a 14-story wooden monster painted the color of dried blood. It sits on a mountainside, overlooking a glacier that constantly moans like a wounded animal. My first few nights were quiet, just the wind whistling through the ore chutes. I stayed in a small, insulated shack on the ground floor, doing hourly patrols with a high-intensity mag light and a body cam. The air inside the mill is different. It's heavy, metallic, and always 5 degrees colder than it is outside. It felt like the building was holding its breath, waiting for me to turn my back. The first real event happened on my 7th night. It was on the 4th floor, near the massive concentration tanks. The room was dead silent when I heard a distinct thud from the floor above me. It sounded like a heavy work boot hitting the timber. I froze, thinking a hiker had broken in. I called out, "Security! Identify yourself." There was no reply, just the sound of someone or something dragging a heavy chain across the floorboards. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I rushed up the stairs, my heart hammering, but the 5th floor was empty. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. I checked the footage on my body cam later that night. When I got to the part where I heard the chain, the audio didn't pick up a scraping sound. Instead, it picked up a low, rhythmic whispering in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like dozens of voices all speaking at once, layered over each other. Beneath the voices, there was a wet, clicking sound, like a predatory insect. I felt a cold chill wash over me. I had been standing in that room for 5 minutes, and I hadn't heard the whispering at all. Only the camera had. Log entry, 2:45 a.m. I started noticing the tapping. It wasn't the building settling. It was deliberate. I would tap 3 times on a wooden pillar, and 3 seconds later, something would tap 3 times on the wall right next to my head. Knock, knock. Knock. It followed me from floor to floor. I tried to ignore it, but then the physical activity started. And I'd leave my flashlight on a crate, turn around to check a sensor, and when I turned back, the light would be standing upright on its lens, or moved to the other side of the room. By the 2nd week, the poltergeist activity escalated. I was walking through the leaching plant when every single locker door in the hallway slammed shut at once. The force was so violent, the metal hinges snapped. I spun around, my light catching a figure at the end of the hall. It was tall, thin, and completely black, like a hole cut out of the night. It didn't have a face, just a slight indentation where a mouth should be. It didn't walk. It glided into the shadows of an OR chute. I didn't chase it. Went back to my shack and locked the door. I reported the intruder to the main office in McCarthy. They sent a supervisor up, a guy named Miller who had worked the site for 20 years. He didn't look surprised when I told him about the shadow. He just told me to stay out of the 1,400 level. Drift. He said the miners in the 30s used to talk about the tall man who lived in the deep shafts. They believed it wasn't a ghost of a dead man, but something that had been in the mountain long before the copper was found. Something the blasting had woken up. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in a place like Kennecott. On a Tuesday night, the air felt thick, like it was saturated with static electricity. I found myself standing at the entrance to the 1,400 level drift, a horizontal tunnel that leads deep into the Bonanza Ridge. My flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the dark, only reaching a few feet. I smelled something foul, rotting meat mixed with wet sulfur. I took 3 steps into the tunnel and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath, but it wasn't white. It was a faint, glowing gray. I heard a voice. It wasn't the whispering from the camera. It was a human voice. It sounded exactly like my mother, Elias. "Is that you? It's so cold in here. My mother has been dead for 10 years. I knew it wasn't her. I knew it was a mimic, a well-documented phenomenon in deep woods hauntings where an entity uses a familiar voice to lure a victim into the dark. I backed away, but the voice followed me, perfectly replicating her tone, her cadence. "Elias, don't leave me in the dark again." I started to run. As I ran back toward the stairs, the mill began to react. The heavy timber beams started to groan and flex as if a massive weight was moving through the walls. Objects began to fly off the shelves. Old rusted tools, copper rivets, shards of glass. A heavy iron wrench whizzed past my ear, embedding itself 3 inches into a spruce pillar. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a localized stone tape event combined with a malevolent intelligence. The tall man didn't want me out, like it wanted me to stay in the dark with it. I reached the 8th floor, gasping for air. I ducked into the old electrical room and barricaded the door with a heavy crate. The scratching started almost immediately. Scritch, scritch. Something was using long, sharp claws to peel the paint off the other side of the door. I held my breath, my hand on my holster, though I knew a sidearm wouldn't do anything to a shadow. Then the scratching stopped, and I heard a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like a large predator, something much bigger than a wolf or a bear. The entity began to manifest towards objects appearing out of thin air. A handful of wet black soil hit the floor in front of me. Then a single gold wedding band that looked exactly like the one my father was buried with. This is a classic tactic used by entities to break down a person's psychological defenses. It was reading my memories, pulling out things that would hurt me. I closed my eyes and started reciting my old service number, over and over, trying to clear my mind of any personal thoughts. It had to be a blank to survive. The room went silent for nearly an hour. I thought it was over. Then, I felt a hot breath on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone in the room. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard a sound. I slowly turned my head, and there it was, crouched in the corner of the ceiling. It was the tall man. Its limbs were impossibly long and multi-jointed like a spider's. Its skin looked like wet gray leather. It had no eyes, just 2 dark pits that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It unhinged its jaw, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth. I didn't think I acted. I threw my heavy maglite at the thing and lunged for the door. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek that shattered the glass in the windows. I burst out into the hallway, the sound of its clicking limbs right behind me. It moved with a terrifying, jerky speed, jumping from the walls to the ceiling. I scrambled down the stairs, jumping half flights at a time. Every time I looked back, the shadow was closer, its elongated fingers reaching for my heels. It wasn't a man. It was an unknown biological entity, something that shouldn't exist in our reality. I reached the ground floor and burst out into the Alaskan night. The moment I crossed the threshold of the mill, the activity stopped. Stood in the snow, shivering, looking back at the dark windows of the 14-story building. Out on the 10th floor catwalk, I saw the shadow standing there, looking down at me. It didn't follow me outside. It seemed bound to the structure, or perhaps the copper in the mountain acted as a conductor for its energy. I didn't wait to find out. I walked 2 miles to the main road and hitched a ride to McCarthy. I quit the next morning. Miller didn't ask for an explanation. He just handed me my final check and told me to keep my mouth shut. He said the insurance for the site didn't cover anomalous events. I found out later that I was the 4th guard in 2 years to leave under mysterious circumstances. One guy had a nervous breakdown. Another just vanished, leaving his truck and his dog at the trailhead. They never found him. They say the mountain claims what it needs to keep the copper veins humming. I moved to a small town in Oregon, trying to put the red ghost behind me. But the activity followed me. It started with small things: the smell of wet sulfur in my hallway, the sound of a heavy boot hitting the floor in my attic. I started waking up with 3 long scratches on my chest, perfectly parallel. The entity from the 1,400 level drift hadn't stayed in Alaska. It had attached itself to me. This is the danger of these places. You don't just visit them, they mark you. They follow you home like a parasite. I contacted a paranormal investigator, a guy who specializes in attachments. He told me that when you experience a high-intensity event like the one at the mill, it creates a tether. The entity isn't physically in my house. It's using my own fear as a gateway. It's feeding on the trauma. It told me to stop talking about it, to stop thinking about it. But how do you ignore the sound of your mother's voice calling you from the kitchen when you live alone? How do you ignore the shadow in the corner that's getting taller every night? I'm writing this because I don't think I have much time left. The tall man is no longer just a shadow in the corner. I can feel its weight on the end of my bed at night. I can hear it breathing, a wet, rattling sound that matches my own heart rate. It's processing me, just like the miners used to say. It's stripping away my humanity, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the fear. I can see the copper rivets appearing on my nightstand, small gifts from the 1,400 level drift. If you ever find yourself in Wrangell St. Elias, stay away from the Kennecott Mill. Don't go inside for a cool photo. Don't go looking for the 1,400 level drift. Some places on this earth were never meant for us. They belong to things that have been here since the ice was young. Things that don't have souls and don't understand mercy. The Red Ghost isn't a museum, it's a cage, and the thing inside is very, very hungry. I can hear the clicking in the hallway now. It's time to turn off the light. Postscript. This account was found on Ilias's laptop by the local police. The front door was locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, and no sign of Elias. The only thing left in the room was a single copper rivet sitting on the keyboard, and the faint smell of wet sulfur. The case remains open, but the investigator notes that the window in the bedroom was shattered from the inside out, as if something had burst through the glass to reach the night sky. Since Elias's disappearance, several other reports have surfaced from the McCarthy area. Hikers have seen a tall, spindly figure moving through the ruins of the Bonanza mine. They describe it as having gray, leather-like skin and moving with a speed that defies physics. One witness claimed the creature was mimicking the sound of a park ranger's whistle to lure people toward the open shafts. The National Park Service has officially closed the upper levels of the mill, citing structural instability, but the locals know the truth. The tall man is an unknown biological entity that appears to thrive in high mineral environments. Some researchers believe it's a form of non-terrestrial intelligence that has been dormant in the permafrost for millennia. As the glaciers melt and the mines are exposed, these entities are being reintroduced to our ecosystem. They aren't ghosts of the dead. They are the original inhabitants of the mountains. They don't want to haunt us. They want to replace us. They are the apex predators of the unseen world. The phenomenon of attachment is the most terrifying aspect of these encounters. It's a form of psychic parasitism. The entity doesn't just attack, it integrates. It learns your fears, your language, and your habits. It becomes a shadow of your soul. This explains why so many people who survive an initial encounter at sites like Kennecott eventually succumb to accidents or disappearances months later. You can leave the mountain, but the mountain doesn't leave you. It waits until you are alone, and then it finishes the harvest. There is a specific signature to these hauntings. The smell of sulfur, the sound of rhythmic tapping, and the appearance of out-of-place artifacts like the copper rivets. These are the markers of a Class V entity. If you experience any of these symptoms after visiting an abandoned industrial site, seek help immediately. Not from a doctor, but from someone who understands the old laws. Do not speak its name. Do not look for it in the dark. And above all, do not answer when it calls you with a voice you recognize. I interviewed a retired miner in Anchorage who worked the Bonanza Ridge in the late 40s. He told me they used to leave offerings at the mouth of the 1,400 level drift tobacco, coins, or a piece of raw meat. They called it paying the landlord. He said if they didn't pay, the equipment would fail, the tunnels would collapse, and men would start seeing the tall man in the shadows of the ore cars. He was the only one in his crew who survived to retirement. The rest stayed in the mountain. The Kennecott Mill remains the epicenter of this activity. It's a nexus point where the veil between our world and theirs is dangerously thin. The high concentration of copper acts as a natural battery, providing the energy the entity needs to manifest physically. Every year, the pulse gets stronger as the permafrost continues to recede. The building is groaning louder, the shadows are getting longer, and the voices on the body cams are getting clearer. The tall man is no longer just a legend. He is a reality. Is it possible that these entities are responsible for the thousands of missing 411 cases in our national parks? The patterns are identical. Sudden disappearances, no tracks, voices calling from the woods, and survivors who are found in a state of catatonic shock. If they are found at all, Wrangell St. Elias is one of the largest wilderness areas in the world, perfect hunting ground for something that can move through the shadows and mimic human speech. We are intruders in their territory, and they are finally pushing back. The last thing Elias wrote before the laptop was recovered was a single line. Deleted but recovered from the cache. It's not in the room, it's in my skin. This suggests a final total integration. The entity doesn't just take the body, it wears it. This explains why some people who return from being missing in the parks seem different. They know things they shouldn't. Their eyes are flat and polished. They no longer feel the cold. They are the watchmen for the entities, hiding in plain sight. My name is Detective Sarah Vance, and I've been investigating the Elias case for 2 years. I've been to the Kennecott Mill. I've heard the tapping. I've seen the shadow at the end of the 1,400 level drift. I'm writing this because I've started to find copper rivets in my desk drawer at the station. I've started to hear my father's voice calling me from the evidence locker. I know what's coming. If you find this, don't look for me. And for God's sake, stay away from the mountains. Story 2. The Sluice Gate Screams. My name is David, a heavy equipment mechanic. In 2014, I worked on a restoration project at the Kennecott Mill. I've worked Siberian oil rigs in the outback, so I don't scare easily. But what happened at the concentration mill, specifically near the subterranean sluice gates, is something I still can't talk about without my hands shaking. It wasn't just a vibe. It was a physical, aggressive presence that inhabited the very iron of the machinery. It felt like the building wasn't just a ruin, it was an organism. The sluice gates are at the mill's lowest point, where ore was washed and sorted. It's a damp, suffocating environment. The walls are thick with an oily black mold, and the air is perpetually freezing. My job was to service the rusted gears of the primary gate, seized by a century of mineral buildup. The project manager called it a straightforward mechanical fix, but the moment I stepped onto the metal catwalk, I felt a heavy, predatory gaze. It was as if the dark was pressing against my skin with intent. The first poltergeist event happened on my second day. I had laid out my tools, a heavy impact wrench, and a set of sockets on a steelwork table. I stepped away for 30 seconds to check a pressure gauge. When I turned back, the wrench was gone. I searched every inch of the workspace. 5 minutes later, I heard a loud clack from above. My wrench was perfectly balanced on a high-voltage conduit 20 feet up. There was no ladder, and no human could have reached that height in total silence. I didn't report it. You don't complain about ghosts in this industry unless you want to be fired. I retrieved the tool and kept working, but as I tightened a bolt, the temperature dropped so fast, my breath froze midair. I heard a wet, slurping sound coming from the sluice, like a large animal struggling in deep mud. I shone my light into the water and saw a face. It was pale, bloated, and hairless, with eyes like flat black stones. It wasn't a reflection. It was looking right at me. The activity is no longer subtle. I was working on the lower bearing when a 50-pound iron gear was thrown across the room. It didn't fall. It was launched with enough force to dent the corrugated steel wall. I heard a high-pitched metallic screech that sounded like a fingernail on a chalkboard amplified 1,000 times. I grabbed my gear and scrambled up the ladder, the sound of heavy, wet footsteps following me. Something was climbing the rungs right behind me, but the thermal camera showed nothing. I sought out Ben, an old-timer in McCarthy who worked the mines in the 40s. I asked about the lower sluices. He told me that during the peak years, 3 men had slipped into the machinery during a flash flood. Their bodies were never recovered. The gears had processed them with the ore. The company covered it up. But the miners refused to go down there alone after dark. They called the area the grinder. He warned me that the machinery didn't just stop because the power was cut. The entity in the sluice isn't a traditional ghost. It's a residual haunting that has become malevolent. It's as if the trauma was absorbed by the copper, creating an elemental force. On my 4th night, the lights in the lower level failed. I clicked on my headlamp, but the beam was unnaturally dim. I felt a cold, wet hand wrap around my ankle. It was inhumanly strong, pulling me toward the open sluice. I felt the grit of the floor scraping against my palms as I fought. I kicked out, my boot hitting something that felt like cold, wet leather. The grip loosened. I scrambled back, but the poltergeist wasn't done. My metal tools started vibrating so hard, they glowed with a faint blue St. Elmo's fire. I felt a surge of electricity, and I was thrown backward into a stack of timber. I lay there, gasping as the voices began. They weren't whispering. They were screaming, a chaotic wall of sound coming from inside my skull. They were replaying the final moments of the men lost in the gears. "Help us. The water is too heavy." The voices overlapped in a terrifying chorus. I looked toward the gate and saw 3 figures in the mist. They were translucent, their bodies mangled and twisted as if they had been through a crusher. Their eyes glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their limbs snapping like dry wood. I realized they weren't just spirits. They were vessels for something much older and hungrier that lives in the dark water of the mountain. The unknown creature finally showed itself. It emerged from the dark water, a mass of black, oily tentacles that looked like liquid copper. It was a cryo-entity, a prehistoric organism trapped in the permafrost. Feeding on the energy of the deaths in the mill, it was using the spirits of the dead miners as lures. I felt my mind beginning to fracture under the pressure of its presence. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a biological intrusion. I could feel its cold static invading my thoughts. I reached the emergency manual override for the sluice gate. If I could close it, I might seal the entity back in the water. I grabbed the iron wheel and turned it. Gears groaned like a giant in pain. The tall man's shadow I'd heard about appeared on the catwalk above, watching silently. He didn't interfere, he just stood there, his faceless head tilted in curiosity. I realized these entities were part of a hierarchy, a complex ecosystem of the unexplained that ruled the Kennecott site long before we arrived. The sluice gate slammed shut with a thunderous boom that shook the building. The screaming stopped. The black tentacles receded, and the mangled spirits vanished. But the room didn't warm up. Stood there in the dark and heard a soft tapping on the iron gate. Tink, tink, tink. It was a rhythmic, intelligent sound. Something was on the other side, and it was thanking me. The entity wasn't angry, it was entertained by the struggle. It had found a new source of energy in my terror. I didn't go back down for the rest of my contract. Told the manager the hydraulics were unstable. I spent my remaining weeks on the upper turbines, but the attachment had already begun. I started seeing black mold growing on my bedroom walls in McCarthy, despite the dry air. I heard a wet slurping sound in my sink every time I turned on the tap. The grinder had marked me. It was following me through the water pipes, a parasite waiting for its next meal. I reached out to an Otna shaman. He told me Kennecott is built on a thin place, a geographic anomaly where the physical and spiritual worlds bleed into each other. He said the copper acted as a conduit, and these unknown creatures had been using the mine as a feeding ground for a century. He gave me a pouch of sage and iron ore sand, warning me to stay away from deep water. The mountain doesn't forget a taste, he said. I left the park that night. The poltergeist activity followed me to Anchorage. In my hotel, the television turned on by itself. The screen was gray static, but the audio was the sound of grinding gears. I saw the 3 mangled miners reflected in the mirror, standing right behind me. Their pale, bloated hands reached for my throat. I threw the pouch of sand at the mirror, and the glass shattered. The figures vanished, but the room smelled of sulfur and oxidized copper. It was clear the entity was no longer tied to the mill. I realized these entities don't just haunt locations, they haunt people. They're information-based entities using our consciousness as a medium. By witnessing the event, I had given the creature a bridge. This is why so many survivors of Kennecott suffer from geological psychosis. The belief they are being pursued by the earth itself. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being hunted by a force that didn't understand space or time. It was a relentless mineral-based predator that had finally found a trail. I moved to the desert, thinking the dry heat would protect me. For 6 months, it worked. But then, during a rare thunderstorm, the activity returned. I woke up to find my kitchen floor covered in 3 inches of freezing, black water that smelled of the glacier. Floating in the water were 3 copper rivets and a tattered piece of a 1930s work coat. The tall man was standing in the doorway, his elongated shadow stretching across the ceiling. He had brought the mountain to me. I've stopped fighting it. These unknown biological entities are being released as the glaciers retreat. It's a mass emergence of prehistoric predators. They don't want to kill us. They harvest our emotional energy. Fear is their power source. I am sitting in my cabin now, watching black mold grow across my laptop screen. Its filaments trace the same jagged patterns as the ore veins in the 1,400 level drift. It is documenting my descent, recording every spike in my pulse as the room begins to vibrate. The mold isn't organic. It's a mineral-based precipitate that materializes when the pulse starts. The air in my home is now cold and metallic. I can hear the sluice gates grinding in the distance, miles from any water. The grinder is using the humidity in my own breath to bridge the gap from Alaska. It's a terrifying realization. You can't run from something that exists in the very air you breathe. I've become a living transmitter for an entity that should have stayed buried. I set up motion cameras, hoping to capture proof. On the second night, the footage showed something horrifying. At exactly 3:03 a.m., black water seeped out from under my bed. A pale, bloated hand with missing fingers gripped the mattress. Then a second hand appeared, then a third. 3 distinct entities were emerging from a space 4 inches wide. They didn't stand up. They unfolded like spiders. They stood over me as I slept, watching me for 3 hours in total silence. They were studying my fear. The footage showed they don't move like us. Their bodies click and snap as they regain form. This is a Class 4 observation event. They are collectors gathering data on human fear thresholds. When the sun rose, they didn't vanish. They dissolved back into the mold. I watched the video 10 times looking for a trick of the light, but it was real. Their skin had the texture of wet stone, and their eyes were hollow pits. They're waiting for me to break so they can finish the harvest. The copper rivets aren't just opports, they are anchors. Every time I find one, the activity gets stronger. I've tried melting them, but they reconstitute on my nightstand an hour later, still warm. The grinder is using these objects to pin its reality to mine. It's occult engineering. The Kennecott mill was the factory, and I'm the finished product it's trying to reclaim. My body is starting to feel heavy, my joints stiffening, as if the mineral is already inside my bones. I contacted a missing 411 researcher. He told me my case is identical to others from the Wrangell-St. Elias region. In every instance, victims reported sulfur, copper artifacts, and mimic voices. Of those people, most are missing. The others are dead. Told me the only way to break the tether is to return to the source. I have to go back to the mill. If I don't, the entity will eventually fully manifest in my home, and I won't be the only victim. The activity became physical again. I woke up with my wrists bound by rusted copper wire that had grown out of the bed frame. I had to cut myself free with a hacksaw. The voices were now calling me by my childhood nickname, a name no one in Alaska knew. Davy, come back to the water. The gears are waiting. I realized the attachment was nearly complete. My house was no longer a refuge. It was an extension of the mill. I packed my bag and headed back north. Coming back to McCarthy felt like walking into my own funeral. The air was thick with blue smoke, and the mountain felt aggressive. I hiked to the mill at midnight, carrying iron ore sand and a high-grade magnet. I didn't use a light. I followed the green ghost glow from the lower levels. The building was screaming, a high-frequency vibration that made my nose bleed. The grinder knew I was home. The air was so thick with static that my hair stood on end as I descended. I reached the sluice gates. The black water was roiling. 3 mangled miners were there, standing on the water like it was solid ground. Behind them, the tall man loomed, his spindly arms reaching for the ceiling. I felt a cold, hard anger. I slammed the magnet onto the primary sluice wheel. The magnetic field reacted with the static, creating a blinding flash of blue light. The entity shrieked, a sound of tearing metal that vibrated through my very teeth. The air smelled of ozone. The sound was deafening. I threw the iron ore sand into the water, shouting the shaman's words. The sand didn't sink. It glowed, creating a containment field around the gate. The black tentacles lashed out, trying to grab me, but they couldn't break the barrier. I felt the pressure in the room shift as the entity fought to maintain its grip on our world. The tall man flickered like a dying film strip, his form losing its density. I was winning, but the mountain was starting to groan. For a moment, the veil lifted. I didn't see a monster. I saw a rift, a jagged tear in the fabric of reality that led to a place of absolute darkness. Thousands of these unknown entities were waiting in the void, their eyes fixed on the opening. I realized the grinder was just a gatekeeper. It was using me as a key to widen the rift. I threw the last of the sand into the center of the tear and turned the iron wheel with everything I had. The sluice gate sealed. The iron fused together as if welded by a sun. The light vanished, the screaming stopped, and the temperature returned to normal. I stood in the dark for an hour, waiting for the tapping. Nothing came. The tether had been cut. I walked out of the mill, my wrists finally stopping their ache. The blue smoke had cleared, leaving the stars bright over the glacier. The building felt like a ruin again, just wood and rust, no longer a living thing. I am the only man to ever shut the grinder and live. I live under a different name now. I don't have copper rivets on my nightstand. I don't hear the voices. But I don't trust the sound of running water, and I never look in the mirror after midnight, because I know that while I closed one gate, there are 70 miles of tunnels left in that mountain, and the tall man is still looking for a new key to the world. Story 3. The Echo in the Chutes. My name is Sarah, and I am a field biologist specializing in acoustic ecology. In the summer of 2018, I was sent to Wrangell's T. Elias to record the seismic singing of the Root Glacier, the way the ice resonates as it shifts. To get the cleanest audio, I set up my recording station in the upper housing of the Kennecott Mills or chutes. It's a vertical labyrinth of timber and steel that acts like a massive pipe organ. I was looking for natural phenomena, but what I captured on my high-fidelity microphones was something that science cannot categorize. It was an entity that didn't just haunt the mill, it learned from it. The first night was uneventful. I spent hours adjusting my hydrophones and contact mics, listening to the deep, rhythmic groaning of the mountain. But around 3 a.m., my headphones erupted with a sound that made me rip them off my head. It was the sound of a woman crying, not a ghostly wail, but a sharp, clear, sobbing sound coming from the chute directly behind me. I shone my light down the vertical shaft, but the beam only hit dust and rusted metal. The crying stopped the instant my light hit the darkness, replaced by a low, rhythmic clicking that sounded like a dry tongue hitting the roof of a mouth. I checked my levels. The recording showed a perfect human frequency, but the waveform was too clean. There were no breaths between the sobs, no intake of air. It was a mechanical reproduction of grief. I told myself it was Aeolian sound, wind whistling through the timber in a way that mimicked a human voice. But then, the sound changed. It began to replicate the sound of my own equipment, the specific click whir of my digital recorder. It was playing back the sounds of the room to me in real time, but with a slight predatory delay that made my skin crawl. Log entry: 1:45 a.m. The mimicry has progressed. I was sitting in the dark, monitoring the glacial shift, when I heard my own voice come from the bottom of the chute. "Is the gain too high, Sarah?" it asked. It was my exact voice, my exact inflection, using a sentence I had muttered to myself 20 minutes earlier. I froze. There is no acoustic phenomenon on Earth that can record, process, and play back a specific sentence with that level of clarity in an abandoned building. I wasn't listening to an echo. I was listening to something that was practicing being me. I decided to leave the upper housing and head back to the base camp, but the mill had other plans. As I reached the heavy timber door of the chute room, I heard the sound of my supervisor, Mark, calling from the floor below. "Sarah, the weather is turning. Need to pack up now." Mark was supposed to be 10 miles away in McCarthy. I moved toward the stairs, but then I remembered Mark has a stutter he's had since childhood. The voice calling from the dark was perfectly fluent. It was Mark's voice, but it was cleaned up, stripped of its human imperfections. I retreated back into the chute room and locked the door. The voice below didn't stop. It began to cycle through everyone I knew. I heard my mother, my college roommate, even the man at the general store. Each voice was a perfect acoustic replica, but they were all saying the same thing. "Open the door, Sarah. It's cold out here." The poltergeist activity began shortly after. The heavy ore buckets, suspended by rusted cables, began to swing in a rhythmic, synchronized motion, hitting the walls with a thundering clang that matched the beat of my own frantic heart. The entity isn't a spirit of a dead miner. It's an acoustic mimic, an unknown creature that lives in the resonant cavities of the mountain. It feeds on sound energy, specifically the emotional resonance of human speech. I watched my frequency monitor as the voices continued outside the door. The waveform was becoming more complex. The entity, learning the nuances of human fear, started blending the voices together, creating a dissonant, multitonal scream that sounded like 100 people dying at once. The floorboards beneath me began to vibrate so hard that my equipment slid across the room. I realized then that the tall man and the grinder from the other accounts were just different manifestations of the same ecological nightmare. This echo, was the sensory version. It didn't need to touch me to kill me. It just needed to lure me into one of the vertical chutes. I heard the sound of a heavy object falling down the shaft behind me. Thump, thump, crash. Then, the sound of my own body hitting the bottom. The sound of breaking bones, and a final wet gasp. The entity was pre-playing my death, trying to manifest the event through sound. I grabbed my recorder, intending to use the feedback loop trick I'd used in the lab to disrupt acoustic interference. I turned my speakers to max volume and pointed the microphone toward the door. As the entity began to mimic my mother's voice again, I hit the reverse playback on a recording of the glacier's tectonic grinding. The sound of shifting mountains, a raw, 120 decibel roar of crushing stone erupted into the hallway. The voices stopped instantly, replaced by a screech of feedback that sounded like a physical animal being wounded. The echo reacted with violence. The timber door didn't just break, it exploded inward, showered by splinters. I didn't see a ghost, saw a void form, a shape in the air that looked like a heat shimmer made of gray static. It had no eyes, but it had hundreds of tiny, vibrating membranes along its limbs that acted like speakers. It was a biological instrument of mimicry. It let out a burst of white noise that knocked me backward, my ears bleeding from the sudden pressure. It stood over me, and for a second, it looked exactly like me, a translucent, flickering Sarah. The mimic reached out a hand made of vibrating air. As its fingers touched my shoulder, I didn't feel skin. I felt a vibration that traveled directly into my bone marrow. It wasn't trying to scratch me, it was trying to sample my internal resonance. I felt my own voice being pulled out of my throat, my vocal cords tightening as if they were being tuned like guitar strings. I couldn't scream. I could only make the same clicking sound I had heard in the chute. I was being silenced so it could take my place in the world. I managed to kick my speaker over, sending a fresh burst of the tectonic roar through the room. The entity recoiled, its form blurring and losing its human shape. I scrambled toward the emergency fire escape, a rusted iron ladder that clung to the outside of the 14-story mill. The wind was howling, but beneath the wind, I could hear the entity mimicking the sound of the ladder breaking. Snap, groan, crack. It was trying to trick my brain into thinking I was falling so I would let go. I closed my eyes and focused on the physical cold of the metal. I made it to the ground, my hands shredded by the rusted iron. I ran toward my truck, but the entity was already there. It was standing in the middle of the road, looking exactly like the park ranger I had talked to that morning. It held up a hand and said in the ranger's voice, "Roads closed. Sarah, landslide at the bridge. You have to go back to the mill." I didn't stop. I knew the ranger was in Glenallen for the weekend. I drove straight through the shimmer, and my windshield frosted over instantly with a pattern that looked like human teeth. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. I finally pulled over. I checked my recording equipment in the back seat. Every single file had been erased, replaced by a single 16-minute track of absolute silence. But when I played the silence back at triple volume, I could hear it. Beneath the noise floor, there was a recording of me, Sarah, talking to my mother on the phone. A conversation I had in my apartment in Seattle 3 weeks before I ever came to Alaska. The entity hadn't just mimicked me in the mill, it had reached back through my history. I quit the research project and moved to the Midwest. But the mimicry didn't stay in the mountains. It started with the crows in my backyard. They stopped cawing and started repeating my name in a flat, metallic tone. Then my neighbor's dog started barking with the exact sound of my own cough. The echo is a high-level parasitic entity. It doesn't need a location. It needs a frequency. By recording it, I had given it a digital body to travel through. It was no longer bound by the copper of the Kennecott Mill. I realized that this is how the unknown creatures of the world propagate. They aren't biological in the way we understand. They are patterns. The tall man is a visual pattern. The grinder is a tactile pattern. The echo is an acoustic one. Once you perceive the pattern, you become a carrier. This explains why the missing 411 victims are often found in areas with high acoustic resonance, canyons, caves, and deep forests. The entity uses the environment to amplify itself until the victim is completely overwritten. I've started to lose my own voice. When I try to speak, the sound that comes out isn't mine. It's the sound of the Root Glacier, the deep tectonic grinding I recorded in the mill. My vocal cords have hardened, calcified by the static. I can see my reflection in the window, and sometimes my face doesn't move when I talk. The mimic is finishing the process. It is becoming the real Sarah, and I am becoming the echo. I am being pushed into the background of my own life. I visited a specialist in acoustic anomalies, a former intelligence. officer who worked on voice stress analysis. He told me that my voice patterns no longer show human variability. I am speaking in perfect, repeated loops. He told me that in the 1950s, the government found a static entity in a cave in the Appalachians that had replaced an entire village. The people looked the same, but they only spoke in the sounds of the forest. They had to burn the village to the ground to stop the transmission. He told me to stop recording everything. But I can't stop. The entity is using my phone, my laptop, my smart speakers. Every device in my house is now a vessel for the echo. I hear Mark's voice coming from my refrigerator. I hear the tall man's clicking coming from my alarm clock. The poltergeist activity has returned, but it's purely acoustic. My furniture isn't moving, but it sounds like it's being smashed to pieces. I live in a world of invisible violence, a symphony of destruction that only I can hear. It's a sensory isolation tactic designed to drive the victim to suicide. I decided to go acoustically dark. I moved into a cabin with no electricity, no phone, and no neighbors. I spent 3 months in total silence, hoping the entity would starve without a frequency to feed on. For a while it worked. The clicking stopped. The voices faded. Started to feel my own vocal cords soften. I thought I had beaten the echo, but then I realized the silence was too perfect. I couldn't hear the wind in the trees. I couldn't hear the birds. Couldn't even hear my own footsteps in the grass. The entity hadn't left. It had muted the world. It had created a phase shift in my hearing. It was canceling out all external sounds so that the only thing I could hear was its own heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the same 3-beat pulse from the Kennecott mill. I realized the mimic wasn't just a voice. It was a tuning fork for the mountain. It was trying to vibrate my body at the same frequency as the copper ore. If it succeeded, I wouldn't just be replaced. I would be shattered. I found a copper rivet in my bed this morning. It's the anchor. The tall man and the echo are working together. One provides the physical anchor, the other provides the sensory override. They are reterritorializing my cabin, turning it into a satellite of the Kennecott mill. I can smell the wet sulfur and the rotted vegetation through the floorboards. The unknown creature is no longer just a shimmer. I can see its footprints in the dust, feet that look like human hands. I reached out to the survivor from Story 1, the guard who saw the tall man. We met in a crowded diner, the noise of the people providing a temporary shield against the mimicry. He looked at me with those flat, stone-like eyes and told me there is no escape. Once the static is in your blood, you belong to the mountain. He told me he started forgetting how to be human, spends hours staring at the walls, listening to the pulse. He said the entities are refining us for a purpose we can't understand. The poltergeist events are now constant. The echo is playing back my entire life to me in 24-hour cycles. I hear my first birthday party, my high school graduation, the sound of my first car crash. It's archiving me before it deletes me. I saw the vessel of the 3 mangled miners from Story 2 standing in my yard last night. They weren't moving. They were just broadcasting the sound of the sluice gates. The hierarchy of Kennecott is fully assembled. They have found their key in the Midwest. I am going back to Alaska. It's the only way to end the transmission. If I can reach the nexus point in the 1,400 level drift, I might be able to reverse the phase shift. I'm carrying a high-frequency acoustic disruptor and a digital copy of the silence I recorded. If I can play the silence back into the heart of the mountain, it might create a feedback loop that collapses the rift. It's a suicide mission, but I'm already a ghost. I can feel the copper in my teeth. I can hear the glacier in my chest. The drive back to Wrangell St. Elias was a journey through a dying world. Every radio station I tuned into was playing the static. Every person I saw at the gas stations looked at me with those same flat eyes. The mimicry is spreading. It's no longer just a localized event. It's a global resonance. The unknown biological entities are using the melting permafrost as a release valve. We are the generation that will witness the Earth's original inhabitants reclaiming the frequency of life. I am standing at the entrance to the Kennecott mill now. The red ghost is glowing with a brilliant violet light. The pulse is so strong I can feel the ground liquefying beneath my boots. The tall man is waiting for me on the catwalk, his spindly arms spread wide in a gesture of welcome. The echo is screaming my name from the ore chutes, 1,000 Sarahs calling me home. I have the disruptor ready. I have the silence loaded, It's time to see who is the real Sarah and who is the echo. I entered the 1,400 level drift. The air here is not air. It is a pressurized ether of sound and mineral dust. I saw the rift that David described in Story 2. It isn't a hole in the rock. It's a hole in the sound of the world. It's a place of absolute, terrifying silence that devours any noise that enters it. I saw thousands of mimics clinging to the walls, their vibrating membranes creating a low-frequency hum that sustains the rift. They are the engine of the mountain. I activated the disruptor and played the silence. The reaction was instantaneous. The mimics began to shatter, their crystalline bodies exploding into clouds of gray dust. The tall man let out a sound that wasn't a mimicry. It was a raw, primordial roar of agony. The pulse reversed, the mountain beginning to implode as the acoustic energy was sucked back into the rift. I felt my own voice returning, sharp human scream that cut through the static. For a second, the world was real again. My name is Sarah, and I am the echo that survived. The real Sarah stayed in the 1,400 level drift to close the gate. I am the recording she left behind, the pattern that made it out. I look like her, I talk like her, and I have all her memories. But when I stand in the sun, I don't feel the warmth. I only feel the static. I am sitting in the McCarthy General Store now, watching the new tourists arrive. They look so warm, so full of noise. I think I'll go introduce myself. I've practiced her smile 1,000 times. Story 4. The Ridgewalker. My name is Elias Vance. In the summer of 2023, I was the lead field surveyor for a mineral exploration firm on the limestone ridges above the Kennecott Mill. I deal in physical data, GPS coordinates, and core samples. I am providing this statement because the official report filed by my firm is a fabrication. The animal I encountered on the Bonanza Ridge was not a bear or a wolf. It was a biological anomaly that has remained undetected in the high-altitude barrens, and it is actively hunting in the region. Our team consisted of 3 men, myself, a geologist named Mike, and a field assistant, Greg. We were mapping limestone formations at the 6,000-foot line, well above the subarctic forest. This is a vertical world of shattered rock and snow. On our 3rd night, the silence was broken by a sound that made my marrow vibrate. It wasn't a howl, it was a rhythmic, high-frequency clicking, followed by a deep, resonant thrumming. It sounded like a massive insect, but the volume suggested significant biological mass. The next morning, I found the tracks in a patch of soft glacial silt near our cook tent. The print was 14 inches long, narrow at the heel, splaying into 4 distinct digits with deep claw indentations. It was digitigrade, indicating a creature built for speed. The stride was nearly 6 feet, and the trackway was perfectly linear. Whatever made these was BiPAP. It had walked within inches of our tents while we slept, and none of our motion-sensitive lights had been triggered. It knew our perimeter. I didn't share the discovery immediately. Morale is fragile in remote work. I took high-resolution photos and logged the GPS coordinates. However, 50 yards from camp, I found a mountain goat, a 300-pound male, lying dead. It hadn't been eaten. Its neck had been snapped with such torque that the vertebrae were protruding. Its chest cavity had been opened with a single, clean incision, and the heart had been removed. The rest of the carcass was left untouched in the dirt, discarded like trash. I spent the afternoon glassing the opposite ridge with my 20 by 60 binoculars. At 1:15 p.m., I caught movement. It wasn't the gait of a grizzly. It was sleek, moving across a 70-degree scree slope with speed that defied gravity. It was pale, the color of weathered limestone, and possessed a long, muscular tail used as a counterweight. It moved like a mountain lion, but when it stopped to observe our camp, it rose to its full height on 2 legs. It was nearly 8 feet tall. Through the glass, I saw it lacked external ears. Its head was flat and triangular, resembling a monitor lizard. Its eyes were large, matte black orbs that absorbed sunlight rather than reflecting it. It stood perfectly still for 10 minutes, watching us. When I reached for my camera, the creature vanished into a narrow crevice. It didn't run. It simply seemed to fold its body into a gap no wider than a human head. Its flexibility was biologically impossible for any standard vertebrate of that size. That evening, the barometric pressure dropped, bringing a willowaw wind. The gale hammered our tents. Amidst the wind, I heard the clicking again, inches from my head on the other side of the rainfly. Click, 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 thrum. It grabbed my bear spray. A silhouette appeared against the fabric, a tall, thin shape with elongated limbs. It wasn't rooting for food. It was leaning over, its face pressed against the tent, seemingly listening to my breathing. It was studying the rhythm of my heart. I fired a flare gun through the tent flap. The red phosphorus illuminated the camp. I saw the creature clearly. It was covered in sparse, wiry white hair that didn't hide the corded gray muscle underneath. Its arms were disproportionately long, reaching past its knees, and its fingers were tipped with translucent obsidian-like claws. It didn't flinch at the light. It simply stepped back into the shadows of a boulder, silent despite the wind. It had no nose, only two vertical slits above a lipless mouth. The next morning, our satellite phone was destroyed. It wasn't chewed, it had been meticulously disassembled. The internal circuitry and copper wiring were laid out in a neat geometric line on a flat stone. This was not the behavior of a curious animal. It was a deliberate disarmament tactic. We were 60 miles from the nearest road, and our communication link was now scrap. Mike and Greg demanded we abandon the gear and descend immediately. We were being hunted by an intelligent predator. We began the descent, carrying only packs. The creature stopped hiding, followed us along the high ridgeline, always visible as a pale blur against the rocks. It was hurting us. Every time we attempted a shorter route through a ravine, the creature would appear on the rim and hurl a single large rock down, not to hit us, but to block the path. It was forcing us to stay on the exposed spine of the ridge, keeping us in sight where we were most vulnerable. By midday, Mike showed signs of neurological distress. He complained of a piercing headache and claimed he could hear the creature talking in his head, high-pitched pulses that made his teeth ache, and then I felt it too. A physical pressure in my inner ear that synchronized with the creature's clicking. I realized this was an infrasound attack. This creature was using a biological sonar to scramble our nervous systems, making us clumsy and panicked as we navigated the treacherous limestone cliffs. We reached the chimney, a narrow vertical drop. Greg went first. Halfway down, he froze. "Elias, it's under the rock," he whispered. I looked down into a narrow fissure. Pale, elongated arm reached out and gripped Greg's ankle. It didn't pull. It simply held him with a grip that crushed the leather of his boot. I fired bear spray into the crack. Sound like a pressurized steam vent hissed out, and the arm retracted. We didn't stop to check him. We just ran. We ran across the limestone plateau. The creature didn't pursue us on the ground. It leaped. It was capable of jumping 40 feet between rock outcroppings, landing with a soft, heavy thud that sounded like dense, impact-resistant rubber. It moved with a stop-motion speed that was difficult for the eye to track. It wasn't a mammal in the traditional sense. Its skeletal structure seemed to be composed of a highly flexible bioceramic material rather than standard calcium-based bone. It was built for impact. We found refuge in an abandoned mining shack near the Jumbo mine portal. We barricaded ourselves inside as the sun dipped behind the peaks. Almost immediately, the scratching started on the roof. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The creature was testing the thickness of the shingles. We sat in the dark. I looked at Mike and saw he was bleeding from both ears. The infrasound had caused his eardrums to rupture. Sat in the corner, staring at the ceiling, shivering as the clicking grew louder. "It's not from here," Mike whispered. "It's a leftover." He was right. This was a relict species, a predator that survived in the geothermal heated cave systems beneath the Wrangell volcanic field. It was perfectly adapted for rock and ice. It didn't view us as intruders. It viewed us as a rare, high-protein food source. It was a physical, breathing animal, but its evolutionary path was entirely alien. It was a specialist designed for a world of silence that we had long forgotten. Around 2 a.m., the roof boards groaned. A single long claw, gray and translucent, poked through the heavy timber. It didn't just scratch. It began to zip through the wood, cutting a perfect circular hole. The claws were serrated and seemed to vibrate at a high frequency, acting as biological saws. I grabbed a piece of rusted scrap iron and jabbed it through the hole. There was no blood, only a thick, clear fluid that smelled like ammonia. The creature let out a deep, resonant boom. The sound was so powerful it caused a temporary blackout in my vision. When my eyes cleared, the scratching had stopped. I risked a look through a gap in the barricade. The creature was standing 100 yards away on mine tailings. It was looking up at the sky, its head tilted. It was ignoring us, focused on something else. I followed its gaze and saw a moving light, a search and rescue helicopter alerted by our firm. The creature wasn't afraid of the machine. It was curious. The helicopter was miles away, but the creature sensed its electromagnetic signature. It let out another boom, and I watched as the helicopter, even at that distance, shuddered in the air, its searchlight flickering. The creature then turned and sprinted toward the high peaks, moving with speed that left a blur in the moonlight. It vanished before rescuers arrived. We were evacuated at dawn. Mike was hospitalized with neurological damage. Greg never spoke again about the Ridgewalker. I was interrogated by wildlife specialists. They confiscated my camera and GPS. They told me that misidentifying wildlife could lead to the revocation of my license. They were desperate to suppress the account. But they didn't find the fragment of the claw that had snapped off in the shack. I had the fragment analyzed privately. The results were impossible. The claw was not keratin. It was a carbon fiber lattice reinforced with silica and copper. It was a bioceramic structure. Its creature had evolved to incorporate the minerals of the mountain into its biology. I've spent the last year digging through unofficial archives. Miners in 1915 spoke of pale walkers snatching pack mules from vertical trails. In 1942, a geological survey team vanished on Bonanza Ridge, leaving behind only tools that had been meticulously disassembled. The local Otna people have stories of rocketers that emerge when the ice retreats. These are not legends. They are biological observations of a cryptic species that has occupied this mountain for 10,000 years, perfectly adapted to the mineral-rich environment. The Ridgewalker is perfectly adapted for the barrens. It has no need for liquid water. It likely absorbs moisture through its skin from fog. Its lack of eyes suggests it perceives the world through thermal imaging and echolocation. This explains its obsession with our electronics. The electromagnetic fields of our phones were like beacons to its sensory organs. We weren't just prey, we were a sensory irritant. It was silencing us to restore the acoustic purity of its territory, protecting its silent domain. The biology is remarkably efficient. The bioceramic skeleton allows it to survive pressures that would crush a mammal. I believe there is a colony of these creatures living in the thermal heated caverns beneath the Root Glacier. As the glaciers melt and human activity increases, we are stumbling into a prehistoric ecosystem that was never meant to be disturbed. The Ridgewalker is the guardian of that threshold, and it is becoming increasingly aggressive toward human incursions as we push further into the high peaks. The Department of Land Management continues to monitor me. I see the white truck near my home. They're terrified of the public finding out there is a predator that cannot be tracked or contained. If the truth came out that it can disable electronics and cut through wood, the tourism and mining industries would face a catastrophic shutdown. The government categorizes these encounters as unexplained disappearances rather than acknowledge a biological reality they cannot control. They would rather let people vanish than lose the revenue. I have started a map of sightings. They are all clustered around high mineral deposits: copper, silver, and limestone. The creature appears to feed on minerals to maintain its structure. The Kennecott Mill, with its concentration of processed ore, is the center of the largest cluster of sightings. The Red Ghost is not a haunted building, it is a high-density feeding ground for an unknown species. Every hiker who visits is potentially walking into a predator's pantry, ignored by the authorities. Mike passed away last month. Official cause was a stroke, but his medical records showed atypical calcification of his brain tissue. It was as if the infrasound had triggered rapid mineral-based growth in his cells. He was being turned to stone from the inside out. I have started to experience the same symptoms: a constant clicking in my ears and a metallic taste in my mouth. The creature marked us with a frequency it can track. It never stopped hunting us. I am going back to Bonanza Ridge. I have built a portable acoustic jammer based on the frequencies I recorded before our phone was destroyed. I need to know if the Ridgewalker is a solitary predator or part of a social structure. I am taking a high-powered rifle with tungsten core rounds, the only thing I believe might penetrate a bioceramic hide. This isn't a hunt. It's a mission to document a truth being buried under government lies and corporate interests. I owe it to Mike. I am recording this at the trailhead. The air is cold and the blue smoke is thick. I can hear the trill already, a faint rhythmic clicking coming from the high peaks. It's not in my ears, it's in my bones. The creature knows I'm here. I've noticed the local birds have gone silent, and the squirrels have vanished from the brush. The ridgewalker has descended from the 6,000-foot line. It is a physical, biological inevitability. Encounter is unavoidable now. If I do not return, do not send a rescue team. The limestone caves are a labyrinth that no human can navigate. You won't find a body, and you'll only be providing the ridgewalker with more organic material to grow its claws. The mountain belongs to the creature, and the creature belongs to the mountain. We are the trespassers in a world that existed long before the first miners struck a pick against the copper. My name is Elias Vance, and I am the last witness. To anyone visiting Wrangell St. Elias, if you find a rock that has been split in half, or if you hear a boom that makes your vision go black, turn around. Do not glass the ridges. Do not think your electronics will save you. The ridgewalker is not a ghost. It is a 7-foot-tall bioceramic armored predator that has had 10,000 years to learn how to kill us. It is the original inhabitant of the high country, and it does not like our presence. I can see it now. Standing on the roof of the old powerhouse, silhouetted against the glacier, it's just watching me. It's taller than I remember, and its skin is glowing with a faint bioluminescent gray dot. It's not clicking anymore. It's waiting. I'm turning off the recorder now. The frequency is too high to bear. The ridgewalker has come down for the final harvest. My name is Elias Vance, and this is the end of the report. Story 5. The Night Shift at 14. My name is Marcus Thorne. For 3 years, I worked as a structural preservationist at the Kennecott National Historic Landmark. My job was to maintain the physical integrity of the 14-story concentration mill. I am not a man prone to superstition. I have spent my life around heavy machinery and decaying timber. I understand how buildings settle under snow. But what happened during the winter of 2024 was not structural decay. I am recording this because the Park Service has listed my resignation as medical leave due to psychosis, and I refuse to let that stand as the only record of what resides in the upper levels of that mill. The 14-story mill is a vertical labyrinth of red-painted wood and massive machinery. In the winter, the tourists are gone, and the town of McCarthy shrinks to a few souls. The mill becomes a tomb. I was the only person authorized to be inside after dark. My routine involved checking support cables and ensuring the snow load wasn't bowing the roof of the lower bins. On December 12th, the temperature hit minus 35 degrees. I was on the 10th level, checking the bearings on a massive copper crusher, when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was the sound of a heavy leather-bound boot striking a floorboard. It was slow and rhythmic. Step, drag, step, drag. It was coming from the 11th level directly above me. I thought it might be a squatter, though why anyone would climb 11 stories into a freezing mill in the middle of a subarctic night was beyond me. I stayed silent, my headlamp dimmed, listening. The drag portion of the step was heavy, like something sharp was being pulled. I called out, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped instantly, leaving a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. I climbed to the 11th level. I had a heavy mag light and a radio. When I swept the floor with my light, I found nothing but the massive silent shapes of the Wilthley tables. Then I saw the trail in the dust. It wasn't a footprint. It was a wide, jagged furrow, as if a heavy iron tool had been dragged through the silt. The trail began in the center of the room and led toward the north wall, where it simply stopped. There were no return tracks. No footprints led to the start of the furrow. It was as if the weight had materialized out of the air. I reported it to the manager. He laughed, suggesting it was a dust devil or a stray lynx. But I knew what I heard. That night, I returned to the mill. I felt a strange tether pulling at my chest. I spent the first few hours on the lower levels, but as midnight approached, I found myself climbing, bypassed the 11th level, heading for the 14th, the very top where the ore cars entered from the tramway. The air there was significantly colder, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the siding. It felt like standing inside a giant dying ribcage. I reached the 14th level at 12:15 a.m. The floor was covered in frost. I sat on a stack of timber and waited. For an hour, there was nothing. Then a smell hit me. It wasn't rot. It was the sharp, metallic temps of raw copper mixed with old, wet wool and something burnt like scorched hair. It was cloying. I stood to leave when the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath not as a mist, but as thick, swirling clouds that seemed to be sucked toward the center of the room by an unseen vacuum. Then came the voice. It was a low, vibrating hum that resonated inside my skull. It sounded like a man speaking through a mouthful of gravel. The grade was too low. The words were devoid of human emotion. I turned my light toward the sound. Standing by the tramway opening was a figure. It was a man in a heavy canvas coat, stiff with grease and ore dust. His face was a waxy mask, and his eyes were empty pits, bored out like drill holes. He held a heavy iron sampling bar, and the end of it was glowing with a dull, internal heat. This was not a vision. I could hear the man's wet, rattling breathing. I could see the floorboards groaning under his weight. He was a solid entity. He didn't look at me, focused on the emptier chutes. He lifted the iron bar and slammed it into the wooden siding. The sound was a physical shockwave that knocked me back. When the bar hit the wood, it turned black and charred instantly. The man turned his head toward me then, a slow, mechanical movement that made the vertebrae in his neck audibly crack like dry sticks. I scrambled for the stairs. I didn't look back until I reached the 12th level, stopped to catch my breath, my lungs burning. I looked up through the open machinery well. A figure was standing at the edge of the 14th level floor, looking down at me. He was leaning over the railing, his dirt-stained fingers gripping the wood so hard I heard it crush. He let out a long, agonizing groan that sounded like metal cables snapping under tension. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering. This was a man who had died in agony and was still dying. I made it out and didn't stop running until I reached my cabin. The next day, I researched accident reports. I found a 1928 ledger. A foreman named Thomas Grier had been killed during a midnight haul. Cable had snapped, and he had been pinned against the siding by a heavy iron sampling bar that had been heated in a forge. The report mentioned the bar seared through his chest. He lingered for 3 hours in the dark before the morning shift found him. The description of his coat and his tools matched the figure on the 14th level exactly. I tried to convince myself it was a residual haunting, a loop in time. But residual hauntings don't react to people. Thomas Grier had looked at me. 2 nights later, I returned to the mill, driven by a need to understand the physical nature of the entity. I brought a thermal imaging camera and a high-sensitivity microphone. I set up on the 11th level. At 1 a.m., the thermal camera glitched, a screen filled with static, and then a solid black shape appeared. It wasn't a cold spot, it was a null spot, a place where heat was being erased from reality. The microphone picked up the step drag sound from the 12th level. I listened through the headphones. Step, drag, step, drag. Interspersed was a faint metallic clinking. I realized it was the sound of coins. Grier had always carried his week's wages in his pocket, afraid of the company's script system. The clinking grew louder, and the sound began coming from all directions. It was in the walls, the ore chutes, the very timber. The mill was becoming an extension of his presence. It wasn't just in the building, he was the building. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. It was turned off, the battery removed, yet a voice came through. It was Grier, Marcus. The cables, they won't hold. Hearing my name sent a jolt of ice through me. I looked at the thermal camera. The black shape was 10 feet away. I looked with my naked eyes and there was nothing. But through the camera, Grier was standing right in front of my tripod, reaching toward the lens. The waxy skin of his face was peeling away in the heatless void, revealing the charred blackened bone beneath the surface. I backed away, but the exit door slammed shut. The iron bolt, which weighed 20 pounds, slid into place as if pushed by an invisible hand. I was trapped, the air filled with a fine, gray dust, or tailings that hadn't moved in 80 years. The dust began to swirl, forming a vortex. Inside, I saw the mill as it was in 1928. I saw the sparks, heard the roar of the crushers, and felt the heat of forges. It was a physical bleed-through of another era. Grier stood in the center, his iron bar glowing white-hot. He walked toward me. Each step cracked the modern floorboards. He wasn't a transparent ghost. He was a solid mass of displaced time. When he reached my equipment, he stepped on the thermal camera. I heard the plastic shatter and the glass grind into the wood. This was the terrifying reality, the ability to exert massive physical force. He raised the iron bar and I saw the red-hot tip inches from my face. I could feel the heat radiating from it, a searing, dry heat that singed my eyebrows and made my skin blister. "I can't get the weight right," he groaned. He swung the bar, and it passed through my shoulder. It didn't cut like a blade. It felt like a bar of solid ice driven through my muscle, followed by intense, agonizing burning. I fell to my knees, my breath hitching. I looked at my shoulder. There was no blood, but the fabric of my jacket was charred, and the skin underneath had turned a bruised, necrotic purple. He wasn't trying to kill me. He was trying to process me, to make me part of the machinery. I managed to crawl toward the ore chute. It was a steep, metal-lined slide that dropped 3 stories. It was a suicide jump, but staying was worse. I threw myself into the darkness. I tumbled down the metal chute, the edges of the steel slicing into my skin. I hit the bottom of the bin with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I lay there, surrounded by the smell of ancient copper and dry rot. Above me, I could hear the step drag of Grier on the metal lip of the chute. He was coming down. I fumbled for my mag light and flicked it on. The beam hit the wall of the bin, and I saw thousands of handprints. They were small, the size of children's hands, pressed into the dust. They were fresh. I realized then that Grier wasn't the only thing in the mill. The mill had employed breaker boys, children who cleared clogs in the machinery. Many had been crushed. I heard their whispers now, a frantic chatter. Hide, hide, hide. The foreman is coming, hide. The sounds weren't in the air. They were in the wood. The whispers came from the walls. I saw the dust move as if small bodies were scurrying behind the timber. Then a child appeared. He was 10 years old, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with a permanent, glassy stare. He reached out and grabbed my hand. His skin was as cold as dry ice. Didn't say anything, but he pulled me toward a small access hatch at the base of the bin. I followed him, dragging my injured shoulder through the tight space. Behind me, the heavy thud of Grier landing in the bin echoed. I crawled through the subflooring, a space filled with rusted gears. The child led the way, his body flickering in and out of the light. He wasn't a guardian. He was a terrified soul doing what he had done in life, hiding from the foreman. We moved through the bowels of the building for what felt like hours. The sound of Grier's footsteps followed us, a relentless heavy pounding that vibrated through the foundation. Grier was tearing the building apart to get to us. I heard massive timbers being snapped and iron plates being ripped from rivets. The child stopped at a heavy iron grate leading to the drainage tunnels beneath the mill. He pointed down into the dark water. I looked back and saw a glow approaching. It was the red-hot tip of Grier's sampling bar. The light reflected off the soot-stained face of the boy, and for a second, I saw his true form, a skeletal, a withered thing with its jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. He vanished, leaving me alone. I kicked the grate open and dropped into the icy water. The current was strong, pulling me toward the creek outside. I waded through the tunnel, my body numb. I looked back one last time. Grier was standing at the grate. He didn't follow me into the water. Couldn't. He was tied to the structure, tied to the floors where he had bled out. Stood there, his empty eye sockets fixed on me, the iron bar glowing a violent, angry crimson. He raised the bar in a mock salute, and then the tunnel collapsed. The weight of the mill brought tons of rock and timber down, sealing the grate. I was swept out into the night. I woke up in the clinic 2 days later. They told me I had been found wandering the airstrip, screaming about the grade. They found the injuries on my shoulder but attributed them to a fall. I tried to tell them about Grier, but they checked the mill and found no structural damage. The 11th level was pristine. The ore bin was empty. There were no handprints in the dust. My thermal camera was found near the stairs, completely intact and functioning. There was no footage of the entity on the card. It had been erased. This is the horror of a high-plausibility encounter. The world resets itself. The entity doesn't leave physical footprints for the authorities. It leaves them on you. My shoulder has never healed. The purple bruise remains, a permanent mark in the shape of a man's thumb and forefinger. On cold nights, the skin there radiates a dull heat, and the smell of ozone and copper fills my room. I can hear the clicking of the coins in my sleep. I know that Thomas Grier didn't go away. He's simply waiting. I resigned the following week. I couldn't look at the mill anymore. I moved to Anchorage, but the silence of the city is different. In the mill, the silence was a physical weight. I've started to notice things here too. I'll be in a modern building, and for a split second, the smell of wet wool and burnt hair will waft through the vents. I'll hear a single, heavy footstep on the floor above me. The bleed-through wasn't limited to the mill. Once you have been processed by an entity, you become a permanent conductor. I recently contacted the woman who took over my position. I didn't warn her directly. I asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about the 14th level. She was silent for a long time on the phone. Then she whispered, "I found a furrow in the dust. It looks like something heavy was dragged toward the north wall." I hung up. There was nothing I could do. To acknowledge the entity is to give it more power. Thomas Grier isn't a ghost. He is a biological and temporal echo that has achieved physical agency. I've spent months studying the physics of residual trauma manifestation. There are papers about how high-intensity deaths in mineral-rich environments can create a biological battery. The copper and limestone of the Kennecott Range act as a natural capacitor, storing the electrical energy of the human nervous system at the moment of death. Thomas Grier didn't pass on because his energy was literally grounded into the mountain. He is as much a part of the Alaskan landscape now as the glacier or the peaks. He is a permanent, haunting reality of history. I am recording this for anyone who finds themselves in the high country mines. Do not go inside after dark. Doesn't matter how many lights you have. The dead in those places don't care about your technology. In fact, they use it. They use the batteries and the frequencies to manifest. If you smell ozone, if you feel a sudden pressure in your ears, or if you hear the sound of a heavy boot dragging across wood, do not investigate. Run. The entities in the mill are not looking for peace. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I am not crazy. I am a survivor of a physical haunting. I have the scars to prove it, even if the Park Service refuses to acknowledge them. The 14-story mill is a monument to tragedy, but it is also a vessel. It is a hollow shell filled with the trapped angry energy of men like Thomas Grier. It is a place where the barrier between was and is has worn thin. If you go there, listen for the coins. Listen for the drag of the bar. I can hear him now. I'm in a hotel room, and the temperature has just dropped. My breath is misting in the air, and it's being pulled toward the closet. I can smell the burnt hair and the raw copper. There is a heavy, metallic thud on the floor above me. Thomas Grier didn't stay in Kennecott. He followed the mark he left on my shoulder. He followed the frequency. I'm turning off the recorder. I have to find a way to ground myself. The grade is too low, and the foreman is coming. Story 6. The repeater at Peak 731. My name is David Miller. I am a Tier 3 systems technician for a telecommunications provider in the Alaska interior. My job is the maintenance of high-altitude microwave repeaters. Reinforced concrete bunkers perched on the most inaccessible peaks of the Alaska Range. These stations are the backbone of the state's emergency communications, designed to withstand 200-mile-per-hour winds and sub-zero temperatures. They are lonely, functional boxes filled with batteries and silence. I am giving this statement because I have retired from field duty following the events at Station 731. I am not suffering from psychosis. What occurred was a localized, violent kinetic anomaly, a poltergeist, in the most literal physical sense, and I am only alive because I understood the mechanical limits of the bunker I was trapped in. Station 731 is located on a limestone spine at 8,400 feet. It is a 12-foot concrete cube anchored into the bedrock with steel pilings. Access is by helicopter only. In October, I was dropped off for a 48-hour maintenance window to replace aging lead-acid backup batteries. The pilot, Elias, dropped me in 3 crates of gear and told me he'd be back in 2 days. As the rotors faded, the silence that rushed in was absolute. There is a pressurized, ringing silence at that altitude that feels like it's trying to squeeze the thoughts out of your head. I unlocked the heavy steel blast door, stepped inside, and began my work. The layout is cramped. 3 walls are lined with equipment racks. The 4th holds 24 deep cycle batteries. Each battery weighs 110 pounds. My task was to slide the old units out and replace them. By 6 p.m., I had replaced 6. I sat on my folding stool, eating a sandwich, when the first anomaly occurred. My primary torque wrench, which I had placed on a rubber mat, didn't just fall. It moved. I watched it slide slowly, as if being pushed by an invisible finger, until it reached the edge of the rack and clattered to the floor. I didn't think much of it. Vibration is constant in these stations, due to the wind hitting the dishes outside. I picked up the wrench and put it back. 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time the wrench was shoved off the rack with enough force to hit the opposite wall. It made a sharp clang against the concrete. I stood up. There was no wind outside. The sensors showed a dead calm. Then the sound started. It wasn't a ghostly moan. It was a rhythmic, metallic thumping coming from inside the battery rack. It sounded like someone was taking a sledgehammer to the lead casings. Thud, thud, thud. I could feel it through the soles of my boots. I checked the voltage on the bus bars, thinking a battery was shorting out. Everything was normal. But as I leaned in, the thumping stopped, replaced by a high-pitched, localized whine, like a jet engine spinning up miles away. Suddenly, the crate of old batteries in the center of the room was flipped over. These were 300 pounds of lead, and they were tossed across the floor like a deck of cards. One shattered against the door, spraying caustic fluid. I scrambled back. There was no one in the room but me. There was no physical explanation for that much kinetic energy to manifest in a sealed box. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a mechanical failure. I was in the presence of a localized kinetic force reacting to my movements. I reached for my satellite phone to call for an early extraction, but as my hand closed around it, the device was ripped from my grip. It was accelerated into the ceiling with such force that the plastic disintegrated. The internal components rained down like shrapnel. I dove under the main equipment rack, shielding my head. The room began to vibrate with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The air grew heavy, smelling of ozone. The poltergeist wasn't a spirit. It felt like a concentrated pocket of gravity that had become hostile. The escalation was rapid. The remaining old batteries, over 1,000 pounds of dead weight, began to slide across the floor toward the center of the room. They weren't being thrown anymore. They were being stacked. I watched as an invisible force piled the heavy blocks on top of one another, forming a crude, jagged pillar that reached toward the ceiling. The sound of the lead casings grinding against the concrete was a screeching noise that set my nerves on fire. When the stack reached 5 feet high, the force paused. The humming died down. I stayed pinned under the rack, barely breathing. I was trapped in a 12-foot square with a force that could manipulate half a ton of lead. I knew I had to get out. The heavy steel door was my only exit, but it was blocked by the battery stack and the debris. I crawled out from under the rack, moving as slowly as possible. As I reached for a crowbar to pry the door open, the stack exploded. The batteries were launched outward in every direction. One missed my head by inches, smashing into the transmitter rack and sending a shower of sparks across the room. The kinetic energy was chaotic, bouncing off the walls. I felt a massive, invisible pressure hit my chest, knocking the air out of my lungs and pinning me against the concrete wall. It felt like a giant, cold hand was crushing my ribs. "Stop!" I screamed. The pressure didn't let up. My vision began to blur. In that moment, I noticed the equipment racks were glowing with a faint heat haze. The poltergeist wasn't just hitting things, it was feeding on the electrical discharge from the station's microwave arrays. Station 731 sits on a vein of magnetite Trich limestone, a natural conductor. The station was acting as a lightning rod for a subterranean energy source, and the poltergeist was the physical manifestation of that discharge. It was a natural, albeit terrifying, anomaly of physics. It wasn't evil. It was just a massive amount of energy that didn't know how to ground itself. The pressure on my chest vanished. I slumped to the floor, gasping. The room was silent again, but the air was thick with the scent of burnt insulation. I looked at the door. The heavy steel had been warped. The frame was buckled outward as if someone had set off a charge behind it. I realized the anomaly was trying to equalize the pressure between the inside and the outside of the bunker. I am a technician. I understand pressure. I knew that if I could ground the system, if I could bleed off the static charge, the kinetic force would have nothing to hold on to. I crawled toward the main grounding bus, a copper bar bolted to the floor. I reached for my insulated pliers, but the room went into a frenzy. Every loose object, bolts, wire clippings, was swept into a violent whirlpool in the center of the room. It was a shrapnel storm. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as a bolt tore through my jacket. I stayed low, dragging myself toward the copper bus bar. The entity seemed to sense my intent. The air grew so cold I could see frost forming. The humming returned. A bone-shaking roar that sounded like a freight train reached the grounding bar and saw the problem. The main braided copper lead had been severed by the initial battery stack collapse. To fix it, I had to find a conductor. I saw a length of heavy-gauge copper wire lying near the door. It was only 6 feet away, but the space was a kill zone of flying debris. I took a deep breath and lunged. An invisible force caught me midair and slammed me into the ceiling. I hit the concrete hard, the impact rattling my brain. I fell back to the floor, my vision swimming. I could feel the energy building for a final, massive discharge. The hair on my arms stood on end. The smell of ozone was so thick, I could taste it, a bitter metallic flavor that coated my tongue. I grabbed the copper wire. The moment my fingers touched it, a bolt of static electricity arched from the equipment rack to my hand. It felt like being hit with a taser. My muscles convulsed, but I didn't let go. I crawled back to the grounding bus, pushing through a physical resistance that felt like wading through thick, invisible syrup. Every inch was a struggle. The poltergeist was no longer throwing things. It was trying to push me away from the bar. I reached the bar and jammed the wire into the terminal. I didn't have a wrench to bolt it down, so I held it there with my bare hand, using a rubber mat to insulate my feet. The effect was instantaneous. A blinding blue arc of electricity jumped from the wire to the bus bar. The room was filled with a sound like a thunderclap. The whirlpool of debris dropped to the floor as if the gravity had been turned back on. Humming vanished. The pressure on the walls ceased. For a moment, there was absolute, terrifying silence. I lay on the floor, my hands scorched from the arc, watching the shimmering haze dissipate. The entity wasn't gone because it was defeated. It was gone because the circuit was closed. The energy had found its path to the earth. Had stayed there for hours, afraid that if I let go, the nightmare would start again. By dawn of the second day, the station was a wreck. The equipment racks were slagged, and the concrete walls were pockmarked. I was battered and suffering from a concussion, but I was alone. The silence was normal again, just the quiet of a high-altitude peak. I spent the next 24 hours using my remaining tools to manually override the warp door. It took every ounce of my strength to pry the steel frame back into a shape that would allow the bolt to slide. I didn't try to fix the radios. I just wanted to be ready when Elias returned. When the helicopter appeared on the third day, I was standing on the helipad, my gear left behind. Elias landed and looked at me, his eyes widening. I was covered in soot, my shoulder bandaged with a greasy rag, and my hand was a mess of blisters. He saw the buckled door and the scorch marks. "What the hell happened, Miller?" he shouted. "Did a battery bank cook off?" I didn't answer. I just climbed into the cabin and buckled my seatbelt. I didn't look back as we lifted off the peak. I was done with Station 731. I spent a week in the hospital in Fairbanks. The official report listed the incident as a catastrophic electrical surge and battery explosion. They blamed a lightning strike. They offered me an early retirement package, which I accepted. They wanted the story buried, and I wanted to be done with the mountains. I had my medical records sealed. The doctors were confused by the atypical bruising on my chest, the shape of a large pressure mark that didn't match the impact of a fall. They couldn't explain how I had survived a surge that had melted industrial-grade copper bus bars. I moved to the Oregon coast. I wanted to be near the ocean, somewhere the air was thick and the ground was damp. I needed to get away from the static-charged atmosphere of the Alaska interior. I haven't picked up a wrench since I left. I don't even like being in rooms with humming fluorescent lights. But the most important thing, the reason I am finally recording this, is that it ended. The horror stayed on peak 731. I don't hear thumping in my walls at night. I don't see things moving. The encounter was a physical event tied to a location. It was a closed circuit. I sometimes wonder if the company sent another tech up there. I imagine them opening that door and seeing the jagged marks on the concrete. I hope they fixed the grounding lead properly. I hope they didn't just slap some new paint on the walls, because that energy is still there, beneath the limestone. It's waiting for the next capacitor to walk into the room. It's waiting for someone to provide the right frequency to bridge the gap. But that isn't my problem anymore. I have seen what happens when the Earth decides to ground itself through a human being. I've had a lot of time to think about poltergeists. In the old stories, they are spirits of the dead. But after what I experienced, I see them as something more grounded. We live in a world of invisible forces, electromagnetism, gravity, tectonic pressure. Most of the time, these forces are balanced, but occasionally the balance shifts. A poltergeist is just a leak. It's a momentary failure of the physical laws we take for granted. It's not haunted, it's just broken. Like any broken machine, it can be dangerous if you don't know where the off switch is. The physical marks on my body have faded. The burn on my hand left a scar that looks like a lightning bolt, a permanent reminder. My ribs still ache when the weather changes, but that's just old age. I don't have nightmares. I don't see ghosts. I just see a concrete room and a copper bar. I see a problem that I solved. I am a technician, and I did my job. I survived the anomaly, and I left it where it belongs, high above the clouds, buried in the rock. I have no desire to be a conductor ever again. I'm finishing this recording because I saw a news report this morning. Small earthquake hit the Hayes Range. It ended right near Peak 731. The report said a communication tower had been knocked offline by a rock slide. I smiled when I heard it. I hope the whole mountain collapsed. I hope the bunker is buried under 1 million tons of limestone, sealing that conductive vein forever. The world doesn't need to know what happens when the mountain gets hungry for kinetic energy. The world is better off with the silence of the high peaks remaining undisturbed. I've made peace with the fact that no one will believe the technical details of my account. People want ghosts. They want spirits and demons and metaphors for their own grief. They don't want to hear about magnetite-induced kinetic anomalies. It's too cold for them, but the mechanical is what makes it real. The fact that I had to use a copper wire and a rubber mat to save my life is the proof. You can't fight a metaphor with a pair of insulated pliers. You can only fight the physical, and I won. To the man or woman who eventually takes my old job, pay attention to the grounding. Don't trust the sensors, and don't trust the silence. If you feel the hair on your arms stand up, or if you hear a tool slide across a table when the wind isn't blowing, don't wait for the escalation. Don't try to be a hero. Get to the helipad and call for a pickup. Tell them the station is electrically unstable. It's the truth, even if it's only a fraction of it. Some places on this earth aren't meant to hold our technology. I am living a quiet life now. Spend my days on the beach watching the tide. It's predictable movement of water and gravity, a force I can respect from a distance. I don't go into the mountains anymore. I don't like being that close to the sky. I like the weight of the sea level. I like the way the salt air grounds everything. My story ended the moment Elias pulled the collective and we rose above that limestone ridge. The door is closed, the bolt is thrown, and the circuit is finally, mercifully dead. I received a letter today from the company's legal department. They're requesting an interview regarding unaccounted-for equipment damage at the site. I burned the letter. They can have the gear. They can have the batteries and the satellite phone. I gave them 20 years of my life and a pound of my own flesh on that mountain. We're even. I'm not going back to testify. They have my statement in the official file, the lie they wrote for me. This recording is the only truth they'll never get. The sun is setting over the Pacific now. It's a deep, calm orange, nothing like the violent red of a flare in an Alaskan blizzard. I feel safe here. The poltergeist of Peak 731 is a memory of a mechanical war, a struggle of physics that I managed to walk away from. There is no haunting. There's no shadow in the corner. There is just the wind and the waves. And for the first time in a long time, the silence doesn't feel like it's trying to crush me. It just feels like peace. Final log entry. David Miller, retired. The station is dark. The mountain is quiet. The account is settled. I'm signing off. Story 7. The Yucatan Breach. My name is Silas Vance. I spent 15 years as a saturation diver and salvage specialist. In the Bering Sea, I am used to the crushing dark and the biological oddities of the deep. I am providing this statement because the salvage of the MV Northern Star was officially abandoned due to unstable seafloor conditions. That is a lie. We abandoned a $40 million wreck because we encountered a predatory organism at 400 feet that makes human activity in those waters impossible. The Northern Star was a 300-foot freighter that sank during a storm off Akutan Island. It settled on a volcanic shelf directly above a geothermal vent. My team was hired to recover mining equipment and plug the fuel vents. The water there is brutally cold and thick with volcanic silt, reducing visibility to nearly zero despite our high-powered halogen lamps. We operated out of a pressurized diving bell, living in a saturation habitat on the surface ship above. On the 4th day, I was on the wreck, cutting through the steel of the number 3 hold. The deep is never truly silent. You hear your rebreather and the metallic groan of the ship shifting. Then, I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a low-frequency vibration, a rhythmic pulsing that rattled my teeth inside my helmet. It felt like the water itself was shivering. I stopped the torch and looked into the dark. The silt was swirling in a chaotic pattern, suggesting a large mass moving just outside my light's reach. I assumed it was a sleeper shark or an orca, attracted by the noise. I resumed cutting, but a shadow passed over me. It was at least 30 feet long, moving with a jerky, undulating motion. It didn't use a tail for propulsion. It seemed to pulse through the water, contracting its body to move. I signaled the diving bell for a sonar check. My supervisor, Mick, came over the comms, his voice tight. "Silas, get back to the bell. Sonar has a high-density mass circling the wreck." "No, it's not a whale. The signature is metallic." I didn't wait. I hauled myself back along the umbilical cord. As I reached the edge of the freighter's deck, I saw it in the peripheral glow of my helmet lamps. The creature was clinging to the vertical hull. It wasn't swimming. It was walking across the steel using dozens of articulated, spindly appendages. They looked like a cross between a crab's leg and a surgical probe. It was a pale, translucent gray, segmented like a giant deep-sea isopod. It was the size of a school bus. It had no eyes, only a series of sensory pits along its flank that glowed with a sickly bioluminescence. It was feeding. It had pinned a 2,000-pound stellar sea lion against the hull and was stripping the blubber with internal, rotating mandibles. The sound was like a mechanical grinder. I killed my lights to avoid detection. I watched in the dim, pulsing glow of the creature's own body. It wasn't just eating, it was absorbing. As it consumed the animal, the creature's skin began to thicken and change color, mimicking the rusted red of the hull. This wasn't simple camouflage. It was rapid cellular restructuring. It was a master of mimicry on a molecular level. I realized why the sonar signature had been metallic. The creature was incorporating the oxidized iron from the ship's hull into its own dermal plating. It was an industrial scavenger, turning human debris into reinforced armor. It was literally becoming the ship. I scrambled into the diving bell and sealed the hatch to begin equalization. Mick was staring at the monitor, his face pale. The external camera showed the creature had finished the sea lion and was focused on our bell. It drifted toward us, its legs trailing like thick kelp. It pressed its face, a flat, featureless disc of sensory organs against the reinforced porthole. We sat in absolute silence, hearing only the hiss of our oxygen scrubbers. The creature extended a long, segmented proboscis from the center of the disc. The proboscis vibrated against the glass at a frequency that made the water in our cups ripple. Then, the inner layer of the triple-pane porthole began to spiderweb. Sensing the heat, Mick whispered. He was right. The bell was a thermal beacon in the sub-freezing water. The creature's bioluminescence shifted from gray to a violent, pulsing red. It was an aggressive signal. It wrapped its spindly limbs around the bell, and the steel began to groan. The creature exerted hundreds of pounds of pressure. It was trying to crack the bell like a mollusk. Our umbilical cord, our only source of air and power, began to strain. If it snapped, we were dead. I grabbed the emergency flare launcher and loaded a high-intensity magnesium charge. I aimed directly at the disc face pressed against the glass and fired. The flare ignited with a blinding white light that filled the dark water instantly. The effect was cataclysmic. The creature recoiled, its body shuddering as the light overloaded its sensory pits. It released the bell and drifted back, its skin turning a panicked black. The light revealed its underside. It was covered in thousands of small, sucker-like mouths filled with needle-sharp obsidian teeth. It wasn't a fish. It was a colonial organism, a collection of units working as one. It fled into the dark with impossible speed. We signaled for an emergency blow-up ascent, bypassing safety stops because the risk of the creature returning was too high. The deck crew were confused until they pulled the bell out. The steel exterior was covered in deep, rhythmic gouges like those from a hydraulic press. Several heavy copper fittings had been dissolved, leaving a pitted, greenish residue. We were lucky the hull hadn't breached. There was a clear, gelatinous film stuck to the porthole. The lab identified it as a concentrated, acidic digestive enzyme capable of breaking down synthetic rubber and reinforced steel. The company took the samples and forced us to sign a lifelong non-disclosure agreement with a massive financial penalty. They towed the wreck into deeper water, claiming it was a navigation hazard. but I knew they were hiding the evidence of what lived there. I spent 6 months researching the Alaskan region in maritime archives. I found Russian whaling logs from the 1840s mentioning the ghost of the vents, a pale creature that attached to wooden ships and dissolved the hulls until they sank. The whalers thought it was a curse, but the many-legged shadow matches the biology I encountered. This relict species lives in hyper-pressurized zones, feeding on mineral runoff from the Earth's crust. When processed metal enters its territory, it shifts its diet. We provided a feast of iron and copper, and it grew to a size the ocean shouldn't support. The creature wasn't just an animal. It was a biological machine that dismantled whatever fell into its trench. The sonar signature wasn't an error. The creature had armored itself with the pulverized remains of ships destroyed over centuries. It was a living monument to maritime disaster. I moved to the Mojave Desert to get away from the coast. I still dream of that featureless disk against the glass and the sound of steel groaning under those legs. The Yucatan breach wasn't an isolated event, so we lose more ships in the North Pacific. We are feeding an apex predator that has waited for millions of years. It is a physical reality we aren't prepared for. It doesn't want territory, it wants material. The company redacted a disturbing part of the lab report, the DNA analysis of that gelatinous film. It didn't just contain the creature's markers. It contained fragments of DNA from a dozen species, including human. That creature integrates the genetic and mineral information of its prey. It is a living record of everything that has died in those waters. When it touched the bell, it was trying to read our technology and our biology. I'm recording this because the salvage industry needs the truth. If you find a wreck in the Aleutians with chewed steel or dissolved copper, do not send divers down. Your equipment will not protect you. I heard another salvage team is heading back to the Northern Star site. They think better submersibles will save them. They are walking into a trap. You cannot fight a creature that mimics your own armor. My name is Silas Vance, and I am the only survivor willing to speak. The ocean is not ours, especially not near the volcanic vents. The breach is open and something is coming up that is learning from us. I've noticed translucent patches on my skin that don't tan. They feel hard like shell. My doctor calls it a reaction to the pressure mix, but I know better. Remember the frequency that cracked the glass. It didn't just vibrate the porthole, it vibrated my cells. The integration works both ways. I left the water, but a part of the Yucatan creature stayed with me, a biological echo, staying in the dry heat, waiting to see if I transform. The salvage firm is done, but for me, this is the beginning of a change I can't stop. I can feel the minerals in my blood hardening into internal plating. I contacted other divers who worked the Yucatan vents decades ago. Most are dead. The survivors share the same symptoms: a metallic taste, sensitivity to high frequencies, and translucent skin patches. We were all read by the organism. We are unintended byproducts of an encounter with a species that doesn't recognize boundaries between observer and observed. We are becoming a slow-motion mimicry of a deep-sea predator, grounded in the desert. The company sent a representative to my home. He didn't offer money. He wanted to see my hands in the progress of the calcification. They aren't helping, they are monitoring. We are test subjects for a new biological armor they want to harvest. They want the organism's ability to integrate materials at a molecular level. They will sacrifice every diver in the fleet to get a viable sample of that cellular structure. I chased the representative away, but they'll return. I've barricaded my house against the light. My eyes are too sensitive now, and I prefer the dark corners of my cellar. The desert is dry, but I crave the smell of salt and ozone. The transformation is accelerating. My fingers are elongated, the joints stiffening into probes. I am losing my humanity to a biology older than the mountains. If the Northern Star appears in a salvage registry, no, it is no longer a ship. It is a shell. It is the armor of a predator growing in the Bering Sea, using our technology to build strength. Do not look for the cargo or the truth. The truth has too many legs and is very hungry. I am writing this while I still have the coordination to use a pen. Soon my hands will only be good for clinging to steel. The government blames Aleutian disappearances on rogue waves or methane releases. They show satellite maps of empty water, but they aren't looking at the seafloor vents where the pressure is immense. That is where the real power lies. That is where the Yucatan creature is multiplying and dividing into thousands of units. We are heralds of a change in the ocean's hierarchy. I can hear the pulsing again. coming from the ground beneath my house. The limestone here carries the same frequencies as the Aleutian ridges. The creature is everywhere, a global network of mimicry we've triggered. Every time we dump metal or drill into the crust, we send a signal. We are inviting the integration. I am a living piece of salvage. I am safe from the company. They won't find a man here, but a monument to their greed. To the divers who come after, stay on the surface. The deep is a world of consumption, not wonder. The Akaton creature is the first of many things in the pressure zones, waiting for us to provide the materials they need to evolve. I am turning off the recorder. The plastic feels strange against my new skin, too soft. I need something substantial to hold. The mountain is quiet, but the vents are calling. My name was Silas Vance. Now, I am part of the wreck. The circle is closed. Stay away from the water. The sea belongs to the mimics. I am signing off. Story 8. The Whiteout. This happened in February of 2025. I worked 60 miles north of Dead Horse, Alaska. My job was to check sensors in the frozen ground. In winter, that place is white and very cold. The sun never comes up. The wind blows snow across the flatland all day. It's hard to see or hear anything. Your eyes play tricks on you because everything looks the same. I lived in a small trailer and worked alone. I never expected to see anything alive out there. One Tuesday, the wind was very strong. It was a whiteout. This means the snow is so thick, you cannot see the ground. I had to go to a sensor only half a mile away. I wore my thickest coat and heavy boots. I had goggles to protect my face. I tied a rope to my trailer so I could find my way back. Cold felt like needles on my skin. I started walking into the wind. I felt the rope pull tight behind me as I moved. I reached the sensor and knelt down. I opened the metal box to check the wires. The wind made a loud whistling sound. Then, I felt a vibration in the ground. It was not a machine, it was a heavy, slow thud. I stopped and put my hand on the ice. I felt it again. Something big was moving near me. I stood up and looked around. The blowing snow blocked my view. I turned on my light, but the white flakes blinded me. I felt very small. I finished my work fast. I was very nervous. In Alaska, you worry about bears? I kept my hand on my bear spray. I grabbed the rope to go back to the trailer. After 10 steps, I heard a loud crack. It sounded like a big piece of ice breaking. It was right in front of me. I stopped and held my breath. The sound was not the wind. It was something heavy moving in the snow. I stood very still. I did not want to make a sound. I waved my light back and forth. For a second, the wind died down. I saw a shape. It was 7 feet tall on 4 legs, but I could see right through it. It was like looking at glass and water. It had no fur or skin. It looked like it was made of frozen rain. It stood perfectly still. If it had not moved its head, I would have missed it. It blended in with the snow. It was a ghost made of clear, hard ice. My heart beat very fast. This was not a bear. Its head moved slow and smooth. It had no eyes, just 2 dark spots. It made no sound except for that ice-cracking noise. I stayed still and held my rope. I knew if I ran, it would catch me. The creature took a step. I saw its foot hit the ground. It had no paws. It had long, sharp points like ice picks. They dug deep into the frozen earth. It was heavy and very real. I backed away slowly. The creature did not roar. It made a clicking sound. It was like tapping 2 rocks together. Every time it clicked, the dark spots on its head grew big. I knew it was using sound to find me. It was too dark for it to see. I found a metal tool in my pocket. I threw it far to the left. The tool hit a metal pipe with a loud clink. The creature turned its head, ran toward the noise of the metal. It moved faster than any animal I know. It did not run. It seemed to slide across the snow. I moved toward my trailer. I pulled myself along the rope. My boots slid on the ice. I heard the clicking behind me. It was faster now. I knew the tool was not alive. It was coming back for me. I heard the crunch of its ice-pick feet. It was gaining on me. I was close to my door. I reached out for the cold metal handle. I fumbled with the door. My gloves were thick, and my hands shook. I heard a loud rush of air behind my head. I dove inside and slammed the door. I locked it fast. Something hit the trailer with a loud bang. The whole floor shook. I fell down and tried to stay quiet. I heard scraping against the metal walls. It sounded like broken glass being dragged outside. The trailer groaned. Something very heavy was trying to get inside. I held my breath in the dark. I crawled to the window and wiped the frost. I saw marks on the metal. Deep, thin lines were cut into the steel. Those feet were harder than metal. I stayed on the floor. The scraping went on for a long time. Sometimes it stopped. I thought it was gone. Then a loud bang would happen on the roof. It was still there. It wanted to get inside the warm room. I sat in the center of the floor. Did not want to be near the walls. I knew the creature liked the heat. My trailer was the only warm spot. I turned off my heater. I sat in the dark. I put on all my blankets to stay warm. The room got very cold. The scraping outside slowed down. The creature was losing my heat signal. I sat there for hours. I did not turn on a light. I did not move. Finally, the scraping stopped. I heard the ice crack sound move away. It went north into the dark. I was alone again. I stayed inside for 2 days. I was too scared to open the door. When the wind stopped, I went outside. I had my rifle this time. I looked at the side of the trailer. There were deep cuts in the steel. Some were an inch deep. On the ground, there were no paw prints. There were just deep, round holes in the ice. They were spaced far apart. The creature had jumped across the yard. It left no hair or smell behind. Only the holes remained. I went back to the sensor. The metal box was crushed. It looked like a giant hammer hit it. The metal was torn. I found the tool I threw. It was flat on the ground. I did not finish my work. I went back and packed my things. I called for a plane. I told my boss the weather was too bad. I told him the gear was broken. I did not tell him about the glass creature. I knew he would not believe me. I just wanted to leave. In the city, I looked for old stories. I found stories about the clear hunter. It only comes out during big storms. They said it is made of ice that never melts. They said never stay in a warm tent in a storm. The hunter can feel the heat from far away. The only way to live is to let your fire go out. You must be as cold as the air. If you stay warm, it will find you. The old stories were right all along. I do not work in the north now. I have a job in a city warehouse. It is loud and full of people. I like that. I like walls and lights. But when the wind hits my window, I think of that night. I think of the clicking sound. I know that thing is still out there. It is sliding through the snow. It is waiting for the next big storm. It is a part of the world we should not see. It is a thing made of ice. I was lucky my door was made of steel. In a tent, I would be dead. I think of other people out there now. They are alone in small huts. They have heaters and lights. They're easy to find. Something is hunting for their heat. I wonder how many people go missing in storms for this reason. They do not get lost. They just stay warm. It is a scary thought. It stays with me every winter. I hope they stay safe in the dark. What was that creature? Is it an animal we do not know? Or is it something very old? Maybe it was frozen for thousands of years. Now it is waking up. The earth is getting warmer. Maybe more of them are coming out. They might be waiting for us to bring our machines north. Then they can feed. I am glad I am in the city. The noise and the roads are like a shield. I do not like the whiteout anymore. Stay inside. I never told my family the truth. I told them the cold was too much. My friends laugh at me. They say I am soft. I do not care. They did not see the marks on the trailer. They did not hear the ice crack in the wind. They think everything has a name. I know some things do not fit in books. I have seen the truth. I respect the cold now. I know what lives in it. I know how it hunts in the white. 1 year later, I saw the news. A man was missing in the same area. They showed his camp. His tent was torn up. His gear was crushed. The news said a bear did it. I saw the marks on the metal poles. They were thin, deep cuts. They were just like the ones on my trailer. My skin felt cold. I knew it was not a bear. I knew the creature found him. He stayed warm in his tent. He never had a chance to run. I wanted to call the news, but what could I say? They would think I was joking, so I just watched. Felt bad for that man. He never saw it coming. He heard a click and thought it was the wind. That is the danger of the north. You think you are alone, but you are not. Something is always watching you. Even if it has no eyes, it knows where you are. It can feel your heart. It can feel your warm breath. I like the cold now. I do not turn my heater up. My girlfriend thinks I am strange. She says the room is freezing. I tell her I like the air. The truth is, I do not want to be warm. I do not want to be a target. I know it is just a feeling, but I cannot help it. Once you are hunted, you never feel safe. You always look at the window. You always listen to the wind. You wait for the ice to crack. Does the frostwalker stay in one place? Does it follow the wind? I hope it stays in the empty north. I hope it never comes to the cities. Millions of warm people live here. But I remember how fast it moved. It crushed metal like paper. If it came south, a house would not stop it. Nothing would stop it. It is too strong. It is too fast. It is a ghost of the ice. We have no way to fight something like that. The sun kills the dark in Alaska. In summer, the land is green. The creature feels like a dream then. Flowers grow and birds sing. The ground gets soft. But under the grass, there is ice. The permafrost never melts. That is where it lives. It is always there. It waits for the sun to go away. It is part of the land. It is as old as the rocks. It is a patient hunter. It is all the time in the world. I live a simple life now. I go to work and come home. I watch movies. I do not go hiking in winter. I do not go camping. I stay near the streetlights. People think I am boring. Think I am smart. I saw the edge of the world. I saw what was there. It was not a god. It was just a thing that hunts. I decided I do not want to be prey. I want to live a long, quiet life. My boss asked why I wear a thin coat. I told him I have thick skin. He laughed at me. He does not know about the clicks. He does not know about the ice picks. He thinks a roof makes him safe. I wish I could think like him. I wish I could go back. I want to be the person I was before Dead Horse, but that person is gone. I am a different man now. See the world for what it is. You cannot go back. Once you know, you cannot forget. It is a heavy weight. Every whiteout on the news reminds me of the rope. I feel the wind pull me. I feel the creature watch me. I am lucky to be alive. I know it every day. I do not take safety for granted. I do not take the heat for granted. I am careful. I am quiet. I stay in the light. I stay where it is loud. If you go to Alaska, be careful. It is beautiful, but it does not care about you. It has things that are very old. If you're in a storm and hear ice break, do not look. Turn off your lights. Turn off your heat. Sit in the dark. Be very quiet. If you are lucky, it will pass. If not, you will not feel the cold for long. The frostwalker is real. It is out there right now in the snow. I will never go back to the North Slope. No amount of money is worth it. I will not stand in that wind again. I've seen enough empty places. I like the city now. I like the noise and the cars. It reminds me that I am human. It reminds me that I am not food. I am a man in a room. I am safe from the ice. I am away from the clicking. I am free of the white. I am glad I told this story. I do not talk about it much. It feels good to say the words. It makes the memories smaller. I hope you take it seriously. Don't look for things in the ice. If you find them, run. The world is bigger than we think. There are things that do not want us here. This creature is just one, or many more in the dark. We are just visitors in their world. That is all I have to say. The wind is picking up outside. I will close my window. I will lock the door. I'll sit in my chair. I am safe here. I will forget the north for a while. I will be a normal guy, but I will keep my ears open. You never know when the ice might crack. You never know when the clicking might start. Stay safe. Stay cold. Watch the wind. Story 9. The Heavy Room. I was hired to clean out an old radar station on a high cliff near Nome. It was a big box made of thick concrete and rusted steel. The building was built in the 1950s and had been empty for a long time. My job was to take out the old copper wires and the heavy lead batteries left in the basement. I arrived on a Monday morning. The wind was hitting the side of the building with a low hum. I pulled my truck up to the main door and unloaded my tools. I was alone. The main door was a thick slab of iron. It was hard to open because the hinges were rusted. When I finally pushed it back, the air that came out of the building felt very heavy. It didn't smell like old dust or rot. It smelled like wet stone and cold metal. I stepped inside and turned on my big work lights. The lobby was empty, except for some broken wooden chairs and old papers on the floor. The concrete walls were 2 feet thick. They were built to keep out the cold, but they also kept in the silence. I started my work in the main control room on the first floor. I had to cut the wires out of the walls. It was slow work. The building felt very still, but it was not quiet. There were small sounds coming from the ceiling and the floors below. I told myself it was just the wind or the pipes cooling down. But the sounds were not random. They sounded like someone was dragging a heavy chain across a floor made of sand. It would start in one corner, move slowly to the middle, and then stop. After an hour, I noticed something strange about my tools. I had a heavy wrench sitting on a flat wooden table. I watched it for a second. It didn't roll, but it shifted. It moved about an inch to the left, then stopped. Then it moved another inch. There was no vibration in the floor. The table was not tilted. I picked the wrench up. It felt much heavier than it should. I put it back down, and it made a loud thud like I had dropped a bag of rocks. The air felt thick. I decided to move to the basement to start on the batteries. The stairs were made of narrow metal grates. As I walked down, the sound of my boots on the metal was very loud. But there was another sound too. Every time I took a step, there was a second footstep that happened a half-second later. It wasn't an echo. The sound was too heavy. It sounded like a boot hitting the metal with enough force to bend it. I stopped on the middle of the stairs. The second footstep happened again. I looked up the stairs. There was nothing there. I looked down into the dark basement. My flashlight beam hit the old battery racks. They were big, black blocks of lead and glass. I walked the rest of the way down. The basement was much colder than the first floor. My breath came out in thick white clouds. I set my light on a pile of crates. I reached for the first battery to see how heavy it was. When I touched the glass, I felt a sharp shock. It felt like my hand was being pulled in. I pulled my hand back and looked at my glove. It was covered in a thin layer of frost. I hadn't been touching ice. I'd been touching a dry glass battery in a dry room. I looked at the floor. Around my feet, the dust was moving in a circle. There was no wind in the basement. The air was dead. The dust was spinning faster and faster. Then, a heavy wooden crate on the other side of the room suddenly slid across the concrete floor. It stayed flat and moved 5 feet. The sound of the crate hitting the pillar was like a gunshot. I stood very still. I didn't want to move because I felt like something was watching my every step. The air was so heavy now that my chest felt tight. It was like being deep underwater. I reached for my light. As my hand got close to the crate, the light itself started to dim. The light seemed to be getting sucked into the corner of the room. The dark was getting solid. It looked like thick smoke that stayed in one spot. I decided I had seen enough for one morning. I grabbed my light and started walking back toward the stairs. But as I moved, I felt a weight on my shoulders. It felt like someone had placed a heavy, wet coat over me. Each step was an effort. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I reached the bottom of the metal stairs. I put my hand on the railing. It was so cold that my glove stuck to the metal. I looked up. The door at the top of the stairs was now shut. I had not heard the door close. A heavy iron door like that makes a loud noise when it hits the frame. But it was shut tight. I started to climb the stairs. Every step was harder than the last. The weight on my back was growing. I felt like I was carrying another person. I could hear a low humming sound coming from the walls. It sounded like a giant machine was turning on, but there was no power. The humming grew louder until the metal stairs started to vibrate under my feet. I reached the top of the stairs and grabbed the door handle. I pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked. It felt like something on the other side was holding it. I put both hands on the handle and leaned back with all my weight. I heard a deep groan from the metal. Then the door flew open. I fell backward onto the concrete landing. The weight on my shoulders was suddenly gone. I sat there for a second, gasping for air. The hallway in front of me was empty. My work lights were all knocked over. I stood up and looked at my lights. They were heavy lamps with wide bases. They were lying flat on the floor. Glass bulbs were crushed, but they weren't broken outward. The glass had been crushed inward. It was as if the air in the room had squeezed them until they popped. I felt a cold wind blow past my face, heading back toward the basement. I picked up one of the lamps. The metal frame was bent. I could see the marks of fingers in the steel, but they were too large. I knew I should leave, but my truck keys were back in the control room. I had to go back in. I walked slowly down the hallway. The floor was covered in old papers, and they were all standing up on their edges. They weren't flying around. They were just balanced perfectly, pointing toward the ceiling. I walked past them, and they didn't fall. The air was so still it felt fake. I reached the door to the control room. I could see my keys on the table. Beside them was my heavy wrench. The wrench was standing up on its end. It was balanced on the small tip of the handle. I didn't want to go into the room. The air inside looked wavy, like heat rising off a road. I took one step into the room. The papers on the floor all fell at the same time. The sound was like a single clap of hands. I ran to the table and grabbed my keys. As soon as my fingers touched the metal, the table was shoved across the room, hit the wall, and broke into pieces. I didn't look back. I turned to run, but the floor in front of the door started to buckle. The concrete was lifting up, as if something huge was moving underneath it. I had to jump over a crack that opened in the floor. A cold, black liquid started to leak out of the crack. It didn't smell like oil. It smelled like the basement. I reached the hallway and headed for the main exit, but the hallway felt longer than it had been before. The end of the hall seemed to be moving away. I kept running, but my breath was getting short. The weight was coming back. It wasn't on my shoulders this time. It was in my lungs. Every time I breathed in, it felt like I was inhaling sand. I stopped for a second to lean against the wall. The concrete felt soft. My shoulder sank into the wall about an inch, as if the building was turning into thick mud. I pulled myself away with a loud sound. The wall had a perfect print of my coat in it. The building was trying to hold me. I heard a loud thud behind me. I turned my head. A large metal locker had been thrown from one of the side rooms into the middle of the hall. It was crumpled like a piece of paper. Then another locker came flying out. Then a heavy chair. They were being tossed around by something I couldn't see. The force was incredible. The air was humming again, louder now. It was a deep sound that made my vision blurry. I could see the walls shaking. Dust fell from the ceiling in thick sheets. I forced myself to keep moving. I was about 20 feet from the main door. I could see the light from the gray sky through the gap in the hinges. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I pushed through the heavy air. My feet felt like they were stuck in tall grass. I looked down and saw that the floor was dipping down under my weight. It was stretching like rubber. Every time I lifted a foot, the floor would snap back up with a loud sound. The building didn't want me to walk. I heard a sound like a large animal gasping for air. It came from the walls. The concrete seemed to be expanding and contracting like a giant lung. The low hum turned into a roar. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears. It was a sound you feel in your stomach. My nose started to bleed. The pressure in the room was rising so fast it felt like my head was in a vice. I reached the main door and put my shoulder against it. It didn't move. The building was holding the door shut. I screamed and pushed as hard as I could. I felt the concrete wall next to me move. A large slab of the wall slid out and blocked half the doorway. It was trying to seal me in. I grabbed a crowbar from my belt and jammed it into the crack of the door. I leaned all my weight on it. The metal bar bent into a curve, but the door moved an inch. A blast of real, cold Alaskan air hit my face. That air felt thin and light. It gave me the strength to push. I heard a sound of something tearing. It wasn't the door, it was the building itself. The ceiling in the lobby started to sag down in the middle. The heavy concrete was drooping like wet cloth. A large piece of the ceiling fell, hitting the floor right behind my heels. It didn't shatter. It landed with a wet, heavy thud. I realized the building wasn't just old. It was full of something that had a physical mass. It was a force that made everything in the room weigh 10 times more than it should. I got the door open far enough to squeeze my body through, but as I leaned out, something grabbed my ankle. There were no hands. It was just a sudden increase in weight. My left leg suddenly felt like it weighed 500 pounds. I was pulled down to my knee. My leg hit the concrete floor so hard I heard the bone crack. I cried out and grabbed the edge of the doorframe. I looked down at my leg. Floor was pulling my boot into the concrete, swallowing it like quicksand. I reached back with my crowbar and smashed the floor around my boot. The concrete broke into dry chunks, and the weight on my leg eased just a little. I pulled my foot free, leaving my boot behind. I scrambled through the opening on one foot and one sock. As soon as my head and shoulders were outside, the roar of the building stopped. It was replaced by the natural sound of the wind and the waves. But I wasn't safe yet. I was still half in and half out of that heavy place. I pulled my other leg through the gap. The heavy iron door slammed shut with such force that sparks flew from the metal. The sound was like a bomb going off. I rolled away from the door and lay on the gravel. I looked back at the building. It looked perfectly normal. It was just a big, gray box of concrete sitting on a cliff, but I could see new cracks in the walls. The building was settling back down, as if it had just finished a very long and hard meal. I crawled to my truck. My leg was screaming in pain and I was shivering from the cold. I looked at my hands. They were covered in that cold frost from the basement. Wiped them on my pants and grabbed the door of my truck to pull myself up. I looked at the building one last time through the windshield. Thick black liquid was oozing out from under the main door, pooled on the gravel and then stayed there. It didn't move even though the ground was sloped toward the cliff. I started the engine and put the truck in gear. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the steering wheel. Looked at the radar station. For a split second, I saw the whole building shift. It didn't move on the ground. It sank into itself. The concrete walls rippled like water. Then it went solid again. It was like the building was breathing out. I realized that the ghost wasn't a person. It was a physical force of gravity and weight that lived inside those thick concrete walls. I drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop to look back until I was a mile down the road. I looked in my mirror. The radar station was just a small speck on the cliff. From that distance, it looked dead and empty, but I knew the truth. I knew that the air inside was still heavy. I knew that the tools I left behind were probably being crushed into flat discs of metal right now. I knew that the building was waiting for the next person to walk through that door. My leg was throbbing. I looked down and saw that my sock was covered in black dust from the basement. The dust was moving even though there was no wind in the truck. It was spinning in small circles on my skin. I reached down and brushed it off. It fell to the floor of the truck and stayed there in a perfect pile. It felt like it weighed a pound, even though it was just a pinch of dust. I realized I had carried a piece of that heavy room out. I reached the main road and headed for the hospital. I didn't care about the copper wire. I didn't care about the batteries or the money. I just wanted to be around people. I wanted to be in a place where the air felt light and the walls didn't breathe. Kept my eyes on the road and didn't look at the mirrors anymore. The sky was getting darker and the first snow was starting to fall. The flakes hit the windshield, and for the first time, I could breathe. I pulled into the hospital parking lot and turned off the engine. I sat there for a minute, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. I was out. I was away from the cliff and the concrete box. I opened the truck door and hopped out on one foot. The air was cold and fresh. I looked back toward the north, toward the radar station. It was gone now, hidden by the snow and the dark. I turned my back on it and limped toward the emergency room door. I reached the glass door and saw my own reflection in the dark windows. I looked like a ghost. My face was white and my clothes were torn to shreds. I leaned my weight against the handle and the door hissed open. I took one last breath of the cold night air and stepped into the bright, buzzing light of the lobby. The heavy weight of that building was finally gone. I didn't look back. I was done. Story 10. The blind thing in the shaft. I've never told anyone about what happened at the Miller mine last summer. I was working as a safety checker for a small crew. The mine is about 50 miles outside of Juneau, hidden in a thick part of the woods. It has been closed for 80 years, but the wood and the stone are still there. My job was to go in first and make sure the floor was solid. I brought a high-powered light and a radio. The entrance to the mine was just a black hole in the side of a mountain. It was covered in old, mossy boards. I had to use a crowbar to pry them open. As soon as the wood moved, a gust of air hit my face. It was ice cold and smelled like wet copper. I stepped inside and turned on my light. The beam was bright, but the darkness seemed to soak it up. I started walking, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots. The first few hundred feet were very quiet. The ceiling was low and I had to duck my head. Every few yards, I would stop and hit the wooden support beams with a hammer. They sounded solid. I didn't see any animals or even spiders. It was too cold for them. I felt okay at first. It just felt like an old, empty place. I kept moving deeper into the mountain, following the old iron tracks on the floor. I reached a part of the mine where the main tunnel split into 3 paths. I stopped to check my map, but the air here felt different. It was heavy and damp. I heard a sound coming from the tunnel on the far left. It was a soft, wet clicking noise. It sounded like someone was tapping a fingernail against a wet rock. I shined my light down that path. The tunnel was empty, but the clicking stopped the second the light hit the walls. I decided to stick to the middle path. I told myself the clicking was just water dripping from the ceiling. But the sound didn't happen again. Usually water has a rhythm, but this was irregular. I walked another 50 feet and found an older cart tipped over on its side. It was covered in thick white mold. I stepped around it, and that's when I saw the first footprint. It wasn't a boot print. It looked like a very long, thin human hand. The print was pressed deep into the mud on the floor. It had 5 long fingers, but no thumb. The tips of the fingers had sharp points that had dug into the dirt. I knelt down to look closer. The mud was still wet inside the print. Whatever made it had been there only minutes ago. I looked ahead into the dark. The light didn't show anything, but I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck. It's being watched. I stood up and gripped my flashlight tighter. I called out, "Hello?" But the only sound was my own voice bouncing back. I should have turned around then, but I had a job to do. Kept moving, but I walked much slower now. Every time I took a step, I would pause and listen. The clicking sound started again. This time it was behind me. It was fast and rhythmic, like someone running on their tiptoes. I spun around and shined my light. The tunnel behind me was empty. I shined the beam up at the ceiling. The rock was jagged and black. I saw something move behind a wooden beam about 20 feet back. It was a pale, fleshy shape. It moved with a jerky, liquid motion. It didn't have hair or clothes. It looked like a person who had been stretched out until their bones were thin. It ducked out of sight before I could get a good look at its face. My heart started to race. I pulled out my radio and tried to call the crew outside. All I got was loud static. The deep rock was blocking the signal. I was alone in the dark with something I couldn't explain. I decided to head back toward the entrance. I turned around and started walking fast. I didn't run because I didn't want to trip in the dark. But as I walked, the clicking sound moved with me. It was in the walls now. I realized the thing was moving through the small gaps in the rock. It knew the mine better than I did. I reached the spot where the tunnels split, but the path I came from was blocked. A large section of the ceiling had fallen. Huge rocks were piled up, sealing the exit. This didn't look like a natural cave-in. The rocks were piled neatly like someone had placed them there on purpose. I was trapped. I had to find another way out. I took the tunnel to the right. My map showed a ventilation shaft at the end of it that led to the surface. The air in this tunnel was warmer and smelled like rotting meat. I saw more of the handprints on the walls now. They were smeared in dark grease. The clicking was getting louder and closer. I shined my light ahead and saw the creature standing in the middle of the path. It was about 7 feet tall and very thin. It was facing away from me. Its skin was the color of a dead fish, pale and translucent. I could see its spine pushing against its back. Its arms were so long the fingers touched the ground. It didn't have ears. Its head was perfectly smooth. I stayed as still as a statue. I turned off my light, hoping it hadn't seen me. The darkness was so thick I could feel it against my eyes. I heard the creature sniff the air. It sounded like a wet growl. I held my breath until my chest hurt. I heard the creature's feet clicking on the stone as it turned around. It started walking toward me. Each step was slow and heavy. Click, click, click. I could smell it now. It smelled like a basement that had been flooded for years. It was only 5 feet away. I could hear its teeth grinding together. I realized it didn't have eyes. Where the eyes should be, there were just smooth, pale sockets. It was blind. It was using sound and smell to find me. I moved my hand very slowly to my belt and grabbed a small, heavy bolt I had in my pocket. I threw it as hard as I could down the tunnel behind the creature. The bolt hit the rock with a loud clack. The creature reacted instantly. It let out a high-pitched scream and lunged toward the sound. It moved faster than any human, disappearing into the dark in a flash of limbs. I didn't wait. I turned my light back on and ran the opposite way. I reached the end of the tunnel and found the ventilation shaft. It was a vertical hole in the ceiling with an old iron ladder. The ladder was covered in rust and slime. I grabbed the first rung and pulled myself up. The metal groaned under my weight. I looked down and saw the creature coming back. It was running on all fours, its long head swinging back and forth. I climbed as fast as I could. The creature reached the bottom of the shaft and began to climb the rock wall next to the ladder. It didn't need the rungs. Its long fingers dug directly into the solid stone like it was soft clay. It was moving twice as fast as I was. I looked up and saw a small circle of gray light far above me. That was the surface. I pushed my body to keep moving, my muscles screaming in the cold air. The creature was only 10 feet below me now. It made a low, bubbling sound in its throat. I reached a small wooden platform halfway up the shaft, scrambled onto it and looked for anything to use as a weapon. There was an old heavy iron gear sitting on the wood. I picked it up. As the creature's pale head rose above the edge of the platform, I swung the gear with all my strength. I hit it right in the face. The creature didn't make a sound. It just fell. It hit the bottom of the shaft 20 feet below with a sickening thud. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I turned and kept climbing the ladder. My hands were shaking so hard. I almost lost my grip. The air was getting fresher now. I could smell the pine trees and the rain. I was only 20 feet from the top. I heard a loud screech from below. The thing was still alive. I reached the top of the shaft. It was covered by a heavy iron grate. I pushed against it, but it was bolted down. I looked through the bars and saw the forest, but I couldn't get through. I heard the scratching sound of the creature climbing the ladder behind me. It was coming back up, and it sounded angry. I looked around the small ledge at the top. I saw a rusted lever that used to control the ventilation fan. I grabbed it. The lever was stuck. I threw my whole weight against it, moved an inch, then snapped. I fell back against the grate. The creature's long, pale hand reached through the rungs of the ladder and grabbed my boot. Its grip was like a steel vise. I kicked out with my other foot, hitting it in its smooth head. It hissed and pulled harder. I felt my leg being pulled toward the edge. I was going to be dragged back down into the dark. I grabbed a loose rock from the ledge and smashed it down onto the creature's fingers. It let go for a second, and I scrambled away. I looked at the grate again. There was one corner where the bolt had rusted away completely. I jammed my crowbar into the gap and leaned back. The metal screamed as it bent. The gap was just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I pushed my head and shoulders through the hole. The creature grabbed my waist from behind. Its skin felt like cold, wet leather. It tried to pull me back down into the shaft. I screamed and grabbed a tree root that was growing near the edge of the hole. I pulled with everything I had. I felt the creature's nails tear through my shirt. The pain was sharp. I gave one final desperate kick and felt myself slide through the gap in the iron grate. I rolled onto the wet dirt of the forest floor. I didn't stop to look back. I stood up and ran toward where I thought my truck was parked. The woods were thick and dark, but the rain helped hide the sound of my footsteps. I could hear the creature screaming behind me. It was a sound of pure anger. I couldn't fit through the small gap in the grate. I kept running, my lungs burning and my leg bleeding. I reached a small ridge and looked down. I saw the lights of my truck in the distance. I scrambled down the slope, sliding on the wet leaves. I fell several times, but I got back up every time. I could still hear a clicking sound in the trees around me. There wasn't just one of them. The forest felt like it was full of those pale things. They were moving through the shadows. They were waiting for me to slow down. I reached the truck and fumbled for my keys. My hands were covered in mud and blood. I dropped the keys in the dirt. I knelt down, searching in the dark. I heard a branch snap just a few feet away. I looked up and saw one of the creatures standing at the edge of the clearing. It was crouching low, its long arms twitching. It was waiting for me to make a move. I found the keys and stood up. I dove into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The creature lunged at the truck. It hit the driver's side window with its head. The glass cracked, but it didn't break. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. I turned on the high beams. The creature shrieked and covered its smooth face with its hands. The light was painful to it. I put the truck in gear. I floored the gas and drove away from that clearing as fast as the truck would go. I looked in the mirror and saw the creature standing in the road, shrinking into the distance. It didn't try to follow me once the truck hit the main road. I drove for 2 hours without stopping. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the wheel. Every time I passed a shadow on the side of the road, I flinched. I finally made it to a gas station in town. I went into the bathroom and cleaned the blood off my waist and leg. The scratches weren't deep, but they were red and angry. I threw my torn shirt in the trash and bought a new one from the shelf. I sat in my truck for a long time, watching the people go about their lives. They had no idea what was living in the mountain just 50 miles away. I called my boss that night and quit. I told him I had an accident and I was done with mine work. He didn't ask questions. I packed my things and moved to the city the next day. I sold my truck because I couldn't stand to look at the cracks in the window. I got a job working in a bright office where there are no dark corners and no stone walls. I feel safer here. I never went back to Juneau, and I never told the crew what I saw. I heard later that the company decided to seal the Miller mine permanently instead of reopening it, said the rock was too unstable. I know the real reason. I still don't like the dark, and I sleep with a light on every night. That's my story. I'm out now, I'm safe, and I'm never going near a mine again. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as unsettling as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more strange explorations. See you next time.